Picture this. You're floating in warm, shallow waters 400 million years ago. The world around you is alien, hostile, and unforgiving. There are no birds in the sky because there is no sky as we know it. There are no mammals, no reptiles, no amphibians. The land stretches endlessly before you, a barren wasteland of rock and primitive plants. And yet, beneath the surface of these ancient seas, something extraordinary is about to happen. A revolution so profound that it will reshape the entire future of life on Earth. Tonight, we're traveling back to witness the most daring evolutionary leap in our planet's history. The moment when life first crawled out of the water and took its first trembling steps on dry land. This isn't just another story about prehistoric creatures. This is the story of courage, adaptation, and survival against impossible odds. The story of how a handful of brave pioneers risked everything to colonize a world that had never known the touch of a vertebrate foot. Before we dive into this incredible journey, take a moment to like this video if you're ready to explore deep time with me, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how this ancient story connects people across the globe, just as these first landwalkers connected two worlds 400 million years ago. Now, settle in as we travel back to the late Devonian period, a time when Earth was writing the first chapter of a story that would eventually lead to you sitting here, watching this video. Because every breath you take, every step you make, every moment of your terrestrial existence traces back to this singular moment in deep time. The year is 375 million years ago. If you could somehow find yourself standing on the shores of this ancient world, you'd be witnessing something that had never happened before in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth. The first vertebrate animals were about to leave the water forever. But let's be clear about what this world looked like. The Devonian period, often called the Age of Fishes, was a time of dramatic environmental change. The climate was warm, almost tropical, with average temperatures reaching 30 degrees Celsius in some regions. There were no ice caps, no polar regions as we know them today. The atmosphere contained significantly more carbon dioxide than our modern world, and oxygen levels were beginning to rise, though they hadn't yet reached the concentrations that would later fuel the Age of Giants. The continents were arranged very differently. What we now call North America and Europe were joined together in a massive landmass called Laurussia. This supercontinent was slowly colliding with Gondwana, the southern landmass that would eventually become South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India. Between these colliding giants lay vast, shallow seas teeming with life, and what life it was! The oceans were dominated by creatures that would seem utterly alien to modern eyes. Massive armoured fish called placoderms ruled the depths, some growing to lengths of over 10 metres. These weren't the sleek, streamlined fish we know today. They were living tanks, covered in bony armour plates, with jaws that could crush almost anything they encountered. But it wasn't the giants that would make history. It was something much smaller, much more subtle. Swimming in the shallow coastal waters were creatures that looked like a cross between a fish and something else entirely. Something that was about to change everything. The transition from water to land wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was a slow, methodical process that took millions of years and countless generations of trial and error. To understand how it happened, we need to understand the evolutionary pressures that made this incredible leap not just possible, but necessary. Life in the Devonian seas was becoming increasingly competitive. The explosion of fish diversity meant that every ecological niche was being filled, every food source exploited. Predation pressure was intense. If you were a small fish trying to survive in these waters, you faced constant danger from creatures with jaws designed to crush bone and armour thick enough to deflect any attack. But there was something else happening. The climate was changing, becoming more seasonal, more variable. Shallow coastal waters that had been permanent fixtures for millions of years were beginning to dry up during certain seasons. Rivers would swell with seasonal floods, then shrink to isolated pools. For most aquatic creatures, this was a death sentence. But for a few remarkable species, it became an opportunity. These were the lobe-finned fishes, members of a group called sarcopterygians. Unlike their ray-finned cousins that dominated the open ocean, these creatures had something special. Their fins weren't just thin, flexible structures designed for swimming. They contained robust internal bones, muscles, and joints that could support weight and provide leverage. The most famous of these transitional creatures is Tiktaalik, discovered in the Canadian Arctic by paleontologist Neil Shubin and his team in 2004. When Shubin first saw the fossil emerging from the rock, he knew immediately that he was looking at something extraordinary. Here was a creature that seemed to bridge the gap between fish and land animals so perfectly that it almost seemed designed to prove evolutionary theory. Tiktaalik lived 375 million years ago in the shallow streams and lagoons of what was then a tropical archipelago. It was a substantial creature, measuring up to 3 meters in length, with a flattened crocodile-like skull and eyes positioned on top of its head. This wasn't an animal built for the open ocean. This was a shallow water predator, perfectly adapted for life at the boundary between two worlds. The most remarkable thing about Tiktaalik wasn't its size or its predatory lifestyle. It was its fins. These weren't typical fish fins. They were protolimbs, complete with what we can now recognize as primitive versions of the bones that make up our own arms and hands. The humerus, radius, and ulna were all there, arranged in the same pattern we see in every tetrapod that would follow. But Tiktaalik wasn't walking on land. Not yet. It was using these primitive limbs to prop itself up in shallow water, to push through dense vegetation, to navigate the complex three-dimensional environment of coastal wetlands. It was, in essence, learning to use limbs while still living an aquatic lifestyle. The genius of this evolutionary strategy becomes clear when we consider the environment Tiktaalik inhabited. The late Devonian was a time of dramatic seasonal variation. Rivers would flood during wet seasons, creating vast shallow lakes and wetlands. But during dry seasons, these same areas would become a maze of isolated pools, mudflats, and temporary streams. For most fish, being trapped in a drying pool meant death. But for Tiktaalik, it meant opportunity. Those powerful fins could push through mud, prop the animal up to gulp air at the surface, and even possibly allow short excursions onto mudflats between pools. It wasn't true terrestrial locomotion, but it was the beginning of something revolutionary. The breathing apparatus of these transitional forms was equally remarkable. Tiktaalik had both gills and primitive lungs. This wasn't unusual among lobe-finned fishes. Many modern species, like the African lungfish, have similar dual respiratory systems. But in Tiktaalik, we see the beginnings of the structural changes that would eventually allow vertebrates to breathe air efficiently. The gills were still the primary respiratory organs, but the lungs were becoming more sophisticated, more capable of extracting oxygen from air, rather than just serving as supplementary organs for times when water oxygen was low. The skull structure shows modifications to accommodate this dual system, with changes in the arrangement of bones and the development of internal air passages. But breathing air and moving on limbs were just two pieces of a much larger evolutionary puzzle. The transition to terrestrial life required changes to virtually every system in the body. The skeleton had to become more robust to support the body's weight against gravity. The skin had to develop new structures to prevent water loss. The sensory systems had to adapt to processing information in air rather than water. Most crucially, the entire approach to feeding and predation had to change. In water, prey can be sucked into the mouth using rapid expansion of the gill chambers. On land, this doesn't work. Predators need to actively grab, manipulate, and swallow their prey using entirely different mechanisms. The discoveries in East Greenland revealed two creatures that took this evolutionary experiment even further. Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, both dating to about 365 million years ago, show us what happened when the transition from fins to limbs became even more pronounced. Acanthostega was a revelation when paleontologist Jennifer Clack began studying it in detail during the 1980s. Here was an animal with clearly defined digits, recognizable arms and legs, and a body plan that looked remarkably tetrapod-like. But when Clack examined the creature more closely, she discovered something that revolutionized our understanding of early tetrapod evolution. Acanthostega couldn't walk on land at all. Despite having what looked like functional limbs, despite having 8 digits on each front foot, despite having many of the anatomical features we associate with terrestrial animals, Acanthostega was entirely aquatic. Its limbs couldn't support its body weight. Its digits were connected by webbing. It had internal gills and a lateral line system for detecting water movement. This discovery forced paleontologists to completely rethink the sequence of tetrapod evolution. Limbs didn't evolve for walking on land. They evolved for moving through complex aquatic environments. The ability to support body weight against gravity came later, as a secondary adaptation that allowed these limb-bearing aquatic animals to exploit terrestrial opportunities. Ichthyostega, discovered in the same Greenlandic formations, tells a slightly different part of this story. This creature was larger than Acanthostega, reaching lengths of up to 1.5 meters, and shows clear adaptations toward more terrestrial capabilities. Its limb bones were more robust, its vertebral column was stronger, and its pelvic girdle was more solidly constructed. But recent biomechanical analysis has revealed that even Ichthyostega couldn't walk the way modern tetrapods do. Its hip and shoulder joints lack the mobility necessary for the alternating gait we see in lizards, salamanders, and other four-legged animals. Instead, it probably moved more like a modern seal, using its front limbs to drag its body while its back legs provided some additional thrust. These discoveries paint a picture of evolution as a gradual, experimental process. There was no single moment when a fish suddenly became a land animal. Instead, there were millions of years of incremental changes, failed experiments, and evolutionary dead ends. Many species developed limb-like appendages that never led to terrestrial capability. Many others developed air-breathing abilities that never translated to life on land. The environment these creatures inhabited was unlike anything on Earth today. The late Devonian landscape was dominated by the first forests. But these weren't forests as we understand them. The trees were giant ferns, primitive conifers, and bizarre plants with no modern analogues. Some reached heights of 30 meters or more, creating the first true forest ecosystems in Earth's history. But beneath these towering plants, the ground was largely empty. There were no flowers, no grass, no shrubs in the modern sense. The forest floor was a carpet of primitive mosses, lichens, and decaying plant matter. Rivers meandered through this landscape, creating vast wetlands and seasonal floodplains that provided perfect habitat for the first vertebrates experimenting with terrestrial life. The oxygen levels during this time were crucial to the story. While not as high as they would become later in the Carboniferous period, atmospheric oxygen was rising steadily. This made air breathing more efficient and provided the metabolic support necessary for the energy-intensive lifestyle of early terrestrial vertebrates. But perhaps most importantly, this was a world largely free of terrestrial vertebrate predators. The land was safe in a way it would never be again. The first vertebrates to venture onto this terrestrial frontier faced no competition from other vertebrates. The main dangers came from giant arthropods, early arachnids, and primitive insects, but nothing with the size and predatory capability of the marine environment they were leaving behind. This combination of factors created what paleontologists now recognize as a unique evolutionary opportunity. Environmental pressure from seasonal drying, the availability of untapped terrestrial resources, rising oxygen levels, and the absence of vertebrate competition on land all combined to favour those lineages that could exploit both aquatic and terrestrial environments. The fossil evidence from this crucial period is frustratingly sparse, but every new discovery adds pieces to this incredible puzzle. Trackways discovered in Poland show that tetrapods were walking on land at least 395 million years ago, even earlier than the body fossils suggest. These ancient footprints, preserved in what were once tidal flats, represent some of the oldest direct evidence of vertebrate terrestrial locomotion. What's remarkable about these trackways is their preservation in marine sediments, suggesting that even the earliest truly terrestrial tetrapods were still closely tied to coastal environments. They weren't abandoning the water entirely. They were expanding their ecological niche to include both aquatic and terrestrial habitats. This dual lifestyle strategy would prove to be incredibly successful. The first tetrapods weren't trying to become fully terrestrial. They were becoming more flexible, more adaptable, better able to survive in the variable and unpredictable environments of the late Devonian world. As we piece together this ancient story, one thing becomes clear. The transition from water to land wasn't driven by some inherent desire to colonize new territory. It was driven by the relentless pressure of natural selection, favoring those individuals and species that could exploit resources others couldn't reach. The evidence scattered across museum collections around the world tells us that this transition wasn't happening in isolation. While Tiktaalik was pushing through shallow streams in the Arctic, similar experiments were unfolding on ancient coastlines across the globe. The fossil record from this period, though tantalizingly incomplete, reveals a world in the midst of evolutionary upheaval. In what would eventually become Scotland, primitive tetrapods were leaving their footprints in coastal mudflats. In present-day Australia, lobe-finned fishes were developing increasingly sophisticated limb structures. The transition from water to land wasn't a single event occurring in one location. It was a global phenomenon, driven by worldwide environmental changes that created similar evolutionary pressures across multiple continents. The timing of this transition coincides with one of the most significant botanical revolutions in Earth's history. The later botanists call the Devonian witnessed what Paleo-Devonian explosions of plant life. For the first time in Earth's history, true forests were emerging. Towering lycophytes, ancient relatives of modern club mosses, reached heights of 40 meters. Primitive conifers began to dominate highland areas. Most importantly for our story, these forests were beginning to stabilize freshwater environments in ways that had never existed before. Root systems, some extending meters into the ground, were preventing soil erosion and creating more predictable water cycles. Fallen logs were forming natural dams, creating the kinds of stable wetland environments that would become crucial nurseries for early tetrapod evolution. The biochemical processes of these early forests were pumping oxygen into the atmosphere at unprecedented rates, gradually transforming the very air that early tetrapods would need to breathe. But this botanical revolution created more than just habitat. It created food webs of staggering complexity. Decomposing plant matter supported vast populations of early arthropods. Millipedes the size of modern alligators processed fallen logs. Giant dragonflies with wingspans approaching a meter patrolled the forest clearings. Primitive spiders, some as large as dinner plates, constructed webs in the understory. For the first vertebrates venturing onto land, this represented an almost unimaginable bounty. Here were food sources that no vertebrate predator had ever exploited. Arthropods that had evolved no defenses against vertebrate attack. Ecosystems with energy flowing through them in ways that aquatic vertebrates had never encountered. The skull structure of early tetrapods reveals fascinating adaptations for exploiting these terrestrial food webs. Unlike their fish ancestors, which relied primarily on suction feeding, These creatures were developing increasingly sophisticated jaw mechanisms. The hyoid apparatus, originally part of the gill support structure, was being repurposed into the beginnings of a tongue. Teeth were becoming more varied, more specialized for processing different types of prey. Acanthostega, despite its aquatic lifestyle, shows clear modifications toward more active predation. Its skull is flattened, with dorsally positioned eyes perfect for ambush attacks on prey above. The jaw joint is positioned to deliver maximum bite force. Most tellingly, the teeth show wear patterns consistent with processing hard-bodied arthropods rather than the soft-bodied prey typical of purely aquatic predators. Ichthyostega takes this specialization even further. Its more robust skull construction and powerful jaw muscles suggest a predator capable of tackling larger, more heavily armored prey. Recent analysis of fossilized gut contents from related species reveals fragments of early millipedes, primitive arachnids, and even small early amphibians. These weren't tentative browsers picking at aquatic vegetation. These were apex predators learning to exploit entirely new ecological niches. The sensory adaptations required for this transition were equally remarkable. Water and air have vastly different optical and acoustic properties. Light behaves differently. Sound travels at different speeds and frequencies. Chemical signals dissipate according to entirely different physical laws. The eyes of transitional tetrapods show clear modifications for aerial vision. The cornea becomes more curved to compensate for the different refractive index of air. The lens develops new focusing mechanisms. Most importantly, the entire visual processing system in the brain begins to adapt to the three-dimensional complexity of terrestrial environments. Hearing presented even greater challenges. The lateral line system that allows fish to detect water movement becomes useless in air. Early tetrapods had to evolve entirely new mechanisms for detecting airborne vibrations. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Bones that had originally been part of the gill support structure were gradually repurposed into the first primitive middle ear bones. The fossil evidence shows this happening in stages. In Acanthostega, these bones still retain their original function as gill supports. In later tetrapods, we see the beginnings of their transformation into hearing organs. By the time fully terrestrial tetrapods appeared, a sophisticated middle ear system had evolved, capable of detecting the subtle acoustic cues that would become essential for terrestrial survival. Chemical sensation underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation. In water, dissolved chemicals can be detected over vast distances. Fish can smell prey from kilometers away, following chemical gradients through the water column. In air, chemical detection requires entirely different strategies. The nasal passages of early tetrapods show progressive modifications toward more efficient aerial olfaction. Internal chambers become more complex, providing greater surface area for chemical detection. The connection between the nasal cavity and the mouth begins to develop, eventually leading to the sophisticated chemoreception systems we see in modern terrestrial vertebrates. But perhaps the most crucial sensory adaptation was learning to process balance and spatial orientation in an environment dominated by gravity. In water, buoyancy provides constant support. Movement in 3 dimensions requires different muscle coordination, different neural processing, different integration of sensory information. The inner ear of transitional tetrapods shows clear evidence of this adaptation. The semicircular canals become more prominent, more sensitive to rotational movement. The otoliths, tiny calcium carbonate structures that detect linear acceleration, become more sophisticated. Most importantly, the neural pathways connecting the inner ear to the motor control centers of the brain undergo dramatic reorganization. These weren't minor tweaks to existing systems. They represented fundamental rewiring of the vertebrate nervous system, changes so profound that they would influence every aspect of terrestrial vertebrate behavior for the next 400 million years. The metabolic challenges of terrestrial life were equally daunting. Moving through air requires different muscle arrangements, different energy expenditure patterns, different cardiovascular support systems. The heart of early tetrapods shows clear modifications toward more efficient circulation in a gravity-dominated environment. The three-chambered heart that we see in modern amphibians represents a compromise solution, allowing partially separated circulation of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, while maintaining the metabolic efficiency necessary for both aquatic and terrestrial activity. This wasn't the four-chambered heart that would later evolve in birds and mammals, but it was a crucial intermediate step. Kidney function had to undergo equally dramatic changes. In water, waste products can be diluted and eliminated relatively easily. On land, water conservation becomes paramount. The kidneys of early tetrapods show progressive modifications toward more efficient water retention, changes that would eventually lead to the sophisticated osmoregulation systems we see in modern terrestrial vertebrates. Skin presented perhaps the greatest challenge of all. Fish skin is designed to be permeable, allowing gas exchange and ionic regulation through direct contact with water. Terrestrial skin must prevent water loss, while still allowing some degree of gas exchange and sensory input. The solution that evolved was remarkably sophisticated. Early tetrapod skin developed multiple layers, each with specific functions. The outer layer became increasingly impermeable, while deeper layers retained the capacity for limited gas exchange. Mucus glands evolved to maintain moisture in critical areas. Most importantly, the skin began to develop the complex innervation patterns that would eventually allow touch, temperature, and pressure sensation in aerial environments. These changes weren't happening in isolation. Each adaptation created new evolutionary pressures, new opportunities, new challenges. The evolution of more sophisticated limbs required stronger attachment points on the skeleton. Stronger skeletons required more robust cardiovascular systems to supply the additional muscle mass. More complex sensory systems required larger brains to process the incoming information. The fossil record from this period shows increasing diversity in skull size and internal brain cavity volume. Early tetrapods were literally becoming smarter as they adapted to the cognitive demands of terrestrial life. Navigation in three-dimensional forest environments required spatial processing capabilities that had never existed in their aquatic ancestors. Social behavior was also beginning to evolve in new directions. In aquatic environments, chemical communication dominates. Fish can release pheromones that disperse through the water column, conveying complex information about reproductive status, territorial boundaries, and threat levels. Terrestrial communication requires different strategies. Visual displays become more important. Acoustic signals begin to evolve. The fossil evidence suggests that some early tetrapods were developing the first primitive vocalizations, using modified gill chambers and respiratory structures to produce airborne sounds. The evolutionary pressure driving all these changes wasn't just opportunity, it was also competition. As more lineages began exploiting terrestrial resources, the advantages of being first to colonize new habitats became increasingly important. Species that could move more effectively on land could access food sources that remained unavailable to their purely aquatic relatives. The fossil assemblages from late Devonian terrestrial deposits show clear evidence of this emerging competition. Multiple tetrapod species occupied the same geographic areas, but with increasingly specialized ecological niches. Some focused on aquatic prey in shallow waters. Others specialized in terrestrial arthropods. Still others appear to have been primarily scavengers, processing the growing amounts of dead plant material accumulating in early forest ecosystems. This ecological specialization was driving morphological divergence at unprecedented rates. Skull shapes began to reflect dietary preferences. Limb proportions started to correlate with preferred locomotor modes. Body size began to vary dramatically as different species exploited different-sized prey items. The genetic mechanisms underlying these rapid evolutionary changes remain largely mysterious. We can see the morphological results in the fossil record, but the molecular basis for such rapid adaptive radiation is still being investigated by evolutionary biologists working with modern species. What we do know is that the developmental genes controlling limb formation, skull shape, and sensory organ development were undergoing rapid evolution during this period. Small changes in the timing or intensity of gene expression could produce dramatic changes in adult morphology, allowing rapid adaptation to new environmental challenges. The environmental context of this evolutionary explosion was itself rapidly changing. The late Devonian was a time of dramatic climate instability. Sea levels rose and fell repeatedly. Continental configurations were shifting as major landmasses collided. Volcanic activity was creating new mountain ranges and altering atmospheric chemistry. These environmental changes created a constantly shifting mosaic of habitats. Coastlines advanced and retreated. River systems changed course. Forest composition shifted as climate patterns evolved. For early tetrapods, this environmental instability created both challenges and opportunities. Species that could exploit multiple habitat types had significant advantages over more specialized forms. The ability to survive in both aquatic and terrestrial environments provided insurance against environmental change. When aquatic habitats dried up, terrestrial capabilities allowed survival. When terrestrial habitats became inhospitable, aquatic adaptations provided refuge. This dual lifestyle strategy would prove to be one of the most successful evolutionary innovations in vertebrate history. Modern amphibians, despite their reputation as evolutionary relics, represent one of the most successful vertebrate groups, with species found in virtually every habitat type on Earth. But the late Devonian tetrapods were facing environmental challenges that no modern amphibian has ever encountered. Atmospheric oxygen levels were still relatively low compared to later periods. Carbon dioxide concentrations were much higher. The ozone layer was still developing, allowing potentially harmful ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface. These atmospheric conditions created unique physiological challenges. High carbon dioxide levels could cause respiratory acidosis in animals not adapted to aerial respiration. Low oxygen levels required more efficient oxygen extraction from air. Ultraviolet radiation could damage exposed skin and eyes. The solutions that evolved were remarkably sophisticated. Respiratory systems became increasingly efficient at oxygen extraction. Skin developed protective pigments and repair mechanisms. Eyes evolved protective structures and filtering systems. These adaptations weren't just allowing survival in late Devonian environments, they were creating the physiological foundation for all future terrestrial vertebrate evolution. Every bird that soars through the atmosphere, every mammal that runs across open ground, every human that climbs a mountain, owes its existence to the innovations developed by these pioneering tetrapods 400 million years ago. The magnitude of this evolutionary achievement becomes even more impressive when we consider the failure rate. For every successful lineage that made the transition to terrestrial life, dozens of others tried and failed. The fossil record is littered with evolutionary dead ends, species that developed partial terrestrial adaptations but couldn't complete the transition. Some developed limb-like appendages that never became weight-bearing. Others evolved air-breathing capabilities that never became efficient enough for sustained aerial respiration. Still, others developed terrestrial sensory adaptations but retained body plans that were fundamentally aquatic. The successful lineages were those that managed to coordinate changes across multiple organ systems simultaneously. Limb development had to proceed in parallel with respiratory adaptation. Sensory evolution had to match locomotor capabilities. Metabolic changes had to support the energetic demands of terrestrial activity. This coordination required not just genetic innovation, but also developmental precision. The timing of different adaptive changes had to be carefully orchestrated to produce functional intermediate forms. Too much change too quickly could produce non-viable organisms. Too little change too slowly could leave species vulnerable to more rapidly adapting competitors. The fossil record suggests that successful tetrapod evolution occurred in discrete pulses, periods of rapid change followed by relative stasis. This pattern, which paleontologists call punctuated equilibrium, may reflect the constraints of coordinating complex developmental changes across multiple organ systems. Each evolutionary pulse corresponded to periods of environmental change that created new selective pressures. The most successful lineages were those that could respond to these pressures with coordinated adaptive changes across their entire body plan. The late Devonian represents perhaps the most dramatic of these evolutionary pulses. In the span of just a few million years, vertebrate life made the leap from purely aquatic existence to successful terrestrial colonization. The speed of this transition suggests that the environmental pressures driving it were intense, and the evolutionary opportunities were unprecedented. Modern tetrapods, from the smallest frog to the largest elephant, all trace their ancestry back to this crucial period. The basic body plan established during the late Devonian, forelimbs, lungs, terrestrial sensory systems, and gravity-adapted skeletons, has remained fundamentally unchanged for 400 million years. This evolutionary conservatism reflects the fundamental success of the late Devonian innovations. The solutions developed by early tetrapods were so effective, so well adapted to the challenges of terrestrial life, that they have provided the foundation for all subsequent vertebrate evolution. But the story of the first landwalkers isn't just about biological innovation. It's about the power of evolutionary experimentation, the importance of environmental opportunity, and the incredible creativity of natural selection when faced with unprecedented challenges. The real breakthrough came when scientists realized that the transition wasn't about escaping water at all. It was about mastering both worlds simultaneously. These early pioneers weren't abandoning their aquatic heritage. They were expanding their evolutionary portfolio, becoming the ultimate survivors in an increasingly unpredictable world. Picture yourself as one of these ancient explorers, your body suspended between two realms of existence. Your gills are still filtering oxygen from the water around you, but your primitive lungs are beginning to taste something entirely new. Air, that invisible ocean above the surface, rich with possibilities and dangers that no vertebrate had ever encountered. The first breath of air taken by a vertebrate lung represents one of the most profound moments in the history of consciousness. Not because these creatures understood what they were doing, but because that single breath opened pathways to experiences that had never existed before. The sensation of wind, the feeling of gravity pulling your body towards solid ground, the strange new reality of a world where sound travels differently, where light behaves according to unfamiliar rules, where survival depends on entirely new skills. But let's be brutally honest about what this world offered these pioneers. The late Devonian landscape wasn't some pristine paradise waiting to be colonized. It was harsh, alien, and filled with dangers that would make modern wilderness survival seem like a casual stroll through a park. The atmospheric composition alone would have been challenging for any creature adapted to aquatic life. Carbon dioxide levels were nearly 10 times higher than today's concentrations. Oxygen, while increasing, was still significantly lower than modern levels. The very air these creatures were learning to breathe was a chemical cocktail that would be toxic to most modern organisms. Temperature fluctuations were extreme. Without the thermal buffering effect of large water bodies, terrestrial environments experienced daily temperature swings that could span 20 degrees Celsius or more. A creature that had evolved in the stable thermal environment of aquatic systems suddenly had to cope with scorching days and frigid nights. The ground itself was treacherous. Modern soil, rich with organic matter and held together by complex root systems, didn't exist yet. The substrate these first landwalkers encountered was largely bare rock, loose sediment, and decomposing plant matter that could shift unpredictably underfoot. Navigation presented unprecedented challenges. In water, buoyancy provides constant orientation reference. up and down are clearly defined by the pressure gradient and the direction of gravity. On land, with air providing no buoyancy support, maintaining balance and orientation required entirely new sensory integration and motor control systems. The evolutionary response to these challenges was nothing short of revolutionary. The vestibular system, that intricate network of fluid-filled chambers in the inner ear that controls balance, underwent dramatic modifications. The semicircular canals became more sensitive, more precisely tuned to detect the subtle shifts in orientation that terrestrial movement demands. But balance was just the beginning. Moving efficiently on land required a complete reimagining of vertebrate locomotion. The undulatory swimming motion that had served fish for hundreds of millions of years was worse than useless on solid ground. It was actively counterproductive, creating friction instead of propulsion, expending energy without generating meaningful forward progress. The solution that evolved was mechanically elegant but anatomically complex. Instead of lateral undulation, terrestrial locomotion required coordinated limb movement, alternating support and propulsion phases, and precise timing of muscle contractions across multiple joint systems. Watch a modern salamander walking, and you're seeing the refined descendant of innovations that first appeared in these Devonian pioneers. The diagonal gait, where opposite limbs move in coordination. The subtle shift of body weight that transfers support from one limb to another. The integration of limb movement with respiratory rhythm. These weren't simple modifications of existing systems. They were entirely new motor patterns, requiring new neural circuits, new muscle arrangements, and new sensory feedback systems. The fossil evidence reveals that this locomotor revolution didn't happen overnight. Trackways preserved in ancient sediments show a progression from simple drag marks, where early tetrapods pulled themselves along with their front limbs, to increasingly sophisticated footprint patterns that reveal true alternating gaits. The most remarkable of these trackway sites lies in a limestone quarry in Poland's Holy Cross Mountains. Here, preserved in what were once tidal flats, are the footprints of tetrapods that walked the Earth 395 million years ago. These aren't just random impressions in rock. They're detailed records of how these ancient animals moved, complete with claw marks, pad impressions, and stride length measurements. When paleontologist Per Ahlberg first examined these trackways, he realized he was looking at something that shouldn't exist according to the fossil record at the time. The footprints were 18 million years older than the earliest known tetrapod body fossils. Either the dating was wrong, or the transition to terrestrial life had happened much earlier than anyone had imagined. Subsequent analysis confirmed the impossible. Tetrapods were walking on land nearly 400 million years ago, pushing the origin of terrestrial vertebrates back into the Middle Devonian. This discovery forced a complete reassessment of early tetrapod evolution and highlighted just how incomplete our understanding of this crucial transition remains. The preservation of these trackways was itself a minor miracle. The animals that made them were walking across carbonate tidal flats during a brief window when conditions were perfect for fossilization. The sediment was soft enough to record detailed impressions, but firm enough to maintain those impressions until they could be buried and preserved. Analysis of the stride patterns reveals animals that were already competent terrestrial locomotors. The spacing between footprints, the depth of the impressions, and the absence of tail drag marks all suggest creatures that were supporting their body weight effectively and moving with reasonable efficiency across the substrate. But what were these ancient pioneers doing on land? The answer lies in understanding the ecological opportunities that terrestrial environments represented. The late Devonian forests weren't just providing new habitat, they were creating entirely new food webs, energy flows that had never existed in Earth's history. Decomposing plant matter was accumulating in unprecedented quantities. Fallen logs, leaf litter, and dead root systems were creating vast reservoirs of organic carbon. This detritus supported exploding populations of arthropods, creatures that had never had to defend themselves against vertebrate predators. Imagine the perspective of an early tetrapod encountering this terrestrial bounty. Here were millipedes, as long as your arm, completely defenseless against jaws designed for crushing fish bones. Primitive spiders, with no experience of vertebrate hunting strategies. Early insects with flight capabilities, still too primitive for effective escape. The feeding opportunities were extraordinary, but exploiting them required new hunting strategies. Aquatic predation relies heavily on suction feeding, rapidly expanding the mouth cavity to draw prey in with the surrounding water. This doesn't work in air. Terrestrial predation requires active pursuit, precise bite placement, and mechanical processing of prey items. The skull modifications that enabled this transition are visible in the fossil record. Jaw muscles became more prominent, providing greater bite force. Tooth structure became more varied, with different teeth specialized for gripping, cutting, and crushing. The hyoid apparatus, originally part of the gill support system, began its transformation into the muscular structure that would eventually become the tetrapod tongue. But perhaps most importantly, these early terrestrial predators were learning to hunt with their eyes rather than their lateral line systems. In water, fish can detect prey through pressure waves, electrical fields, and chemical gradients. On land, visual hunting becomes paramount. The eyes of transitional tetrapods show clear adaptations for aerial vision. The cornea becomes more curved to compensate for the different refractive properties of air. The lens develops more sophisticated focusing mechanisms. Most remarkably, the entire visual processing system in the brain begins to reorganize to handle the three-dimensional complexity of forest environments. These weren't minor tweaks to existing visual systems. They represented fundamental rewiring of sensory processing networks that had been stable for hundreds of millions of years. The ability to accurately judge distances in air, to track moving prey through complex three-dimensional environments, to distinguish between edible and dangerous objects using only reflected light. These capabilities required neural innovations as significant as the anatomical changes we see in limbs and respiratory systems. The social implications of these sensory changes were equally profound. Visual communication became possible for the first time in vertebrate evolution. Color patterns, body postures, and movement displays could convey information about reproductive status, territorial boundaries, and threat levels. The earliest evidence of vertebrate visual displays appears in late Devonian tetrapod fossils. Skull crests, unusual fin ray arrangements, and specialized scale patterns all suggest that these creatures were beginning to communicate through visual signals. This was the birth of vertebrate visual culture, the foundation for all the elaborate display behaviors we see in modern birds, mammals, and reptiles. But visual communication was just one component of an emerging terrestrial social complexity. Acoustic communication was also beginning to evolve, though in forms that would seem alien to modern ears. The first vertebrate vocalizations probably emerged from modified gill ventilation patterns, using airflow through respiratory structures to produce primitive sounds. The fossil evidence for early tetrapod vocalization is necessarily indirect, but the anatomical prerequisites are clearly visible. Modifications to the gill arch structure, changes in the arrangement of respiratory muscles, and the development of resonating chambers in the skull all suggest creatures that were experimenting with airborne sound production. These early vocalizations wouldn't have been melodious. They were probably more like the croaking of modern frogs, simple acoustic signals used for basic communication in low visibility environments. But they represented the first time vertebrate animals had produced intentional sounds in air, the beginning of a communication revolution that would eventually lead to bird song, whale calls, and human speech. The energetic costs of terrestrial life were staggering compared to aquatic existence. Moving through air requires constant muscular work against gravity. There's no buoyancy support, no opportunity to simply drift with currents. Every moment of terrestrial activity demands active energy expenditure. The cardiovascular systems of early tetrapods show clear adaptations to meet these increased metabolic demands. Heart structure became more sophisticated, with more efficient pumping mechanisms and better separation of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Blood vessels developed more complex arrangements to ensure adequate oxygen delivery to metabolically active tissues. Respiratory systems underwent equally dramatic changes. The simple swim bladders of fish ancestors were transformed into increasingly sophisticated lung structures. Internal surface area increased dramatically through the development of alveolar-like chambers. Ventilation mechanisms became more efficient, with active inhalation and exhalation replacing the passive gas exchange of aquatic respiration. The coordination between respiratory and circulatory systems required precise physiological integration. Breathing rhythms had to synchronize with heart rate. Blood oxygen levels had to be maintained within narrow ranges to support the high metabolic demands of terrestrial activity. pH balance had to be carefully regulated as carbon dioxide exchange shifted from aquatic to aerial mechanisms. These physiological innovations weren't just enabling terrestrial survival, they were creating the metabolic foundation for all future vertebrate evolution. The efficient oxygen delivery systems first developed in Devonian tetrapods would eventually support the high-energy lifestyles of flying birds, running mammals, and cognitively complex primates. Temperature regulation presented another unprecedented challenge. Water has enormous thermal inertia. Aquatic environments maintain relatively stable temperatures, even when air temperatures fluctuate dramatically. Terrestrial animals had to develop entirely new strategies for managing their internal temperature in environments where thermal conditions could change rapidly and unpredictably. The skin of early tetrapods shows progressive modifications toward more sophisticated thermoregulation. Vascular arrangements became more complex, allowing blood flow patterns that could either conserve or dissipate heat as environmental conditions demanded. Behavioral thermoregulation also began to evolve, with evidence suggesting that early tetrapods were learning to use environmental features like sun exposure and shade to manage their body temperature. But perhaps the most significant challenge was reproduction. Fish reproduction relies on external fertilization in aquatic environments. Eggs and sperm are released into water, where they can survive and develop surrounded by a supportive medium. Terrestrial reproduction requires entirely different strategies. Early tetrapods were still dependent on aquatic environments for reproduction. Their eggs lacked the protective membranes and nutrient stores necessary for terrestrial development. This reproductive constraintually adapted early tetrapods meant that even the most terrestrial to return to water for breeding. This life cycle constraint would persist for millions of years, until the evolution of the amniotic egg finally freed vertebrates from their reproductive dependence on aquatic environments. But during the late Devonian, the tie between reproduction and water meant that terrestrial tetrapods were always tethered to aquatic habitats. The fossil record from this period shows clear evidence of this reproductive constraint. Tetrapod fossils are consistently found in association with ancient lake beds, river systems, and coastal environments. Even the most terrestrially adapted species never strayed far from water sources. This reproductive limitation had profound ecological implications. Early tetrapods couldn't truly colonize inland terrestrial environments. They were restricted to coastal plains, river valleys, and lake shores, where aquatic breeding sites remained accessible. This geographic constraint limited their ecological impact and slowed their evolutionary diversification. But within these constraints, early tetrapods were remarkably successful. The late Devonian fossil record shows increasing diversity in body size, skull shape, limb proportions, and ecological specialization. Some species focused on aquatic prey in shallow waters. Others specialized in terrestrial arthropods. Still others appear to have been primarily scavengers, processing the abundant dead plant material accumulating in early forest ecosystems. This ecological diversification was happening at unprecedented rates. Evolutionary biologists studying modern vertebrates have never observed adaptive radiation occurring as rapidly as the fossil record suggests it was happening during the late Devonian tetrapod explosion. The genetic mechanisms underlying this rapid diversification remain largely mysterious. We can see the morphological results in fossils, but the molecular basis for such rapid evolutionary change is still being investigated using modern species as models. What we do know is that the developmental genes controlling limb formation, skull shape, and organ system development were undergoing rapid evolution during this period. Small changes in gene expression patterns could produce dramatic changes in adult morphology, allowing rapid adaptation to new environmental challenges. This genetic flexibility was crucial because the late Devonian environment was anything but stable. Climate was shifting, sea levels were fluctuating, continental positions were changing as major landmasses continued their slow collision. Volcanic activity was altering atmospheric chemistry. Forest composition was evolving as plant communities adapted to changing conditions. For early tetrapods, this environmental instability created both challenges and opportunities. Species that could exploit multiple habitat types had significant advantages over more specialized forms. The ability to survive in both aquatic and terrestrial environments provided insurance against environmental change. This evolutionary strategy of maintaining dual capabilities would prove to be one of the most successful innovations in vertebrate history. Modern amphibians, despite their reputation as evolutionary relics, represent one of the most successful vertebrate groups, with species adapted to virtually every environment on Earth. But the late Devonian tetrapods were facing environmental challenges that no modern species has ever encountered. The atmospheric composition was radically different. The plant communities were unlike anything in today's world. The absence of other terrestrial vertebrates created ecological opportunities that would never exist again. The success of these pioneering species was far from guaranteed. The fossil record shows numerous evolutionary experiments that failed, lineages that developed partial terrestrial adaptations but couldn't complete the transition. For every successful tetrapod lineage, there were probably dozens of unsuccessful attempts. The difference between success and failure often came down to timing. Species that attempted terrestrial adaptation too early faced environments that weren't yet suitable for vertebrate life. Those that adapted too late found themselves competing with more established terrestrial lineages. The successful lineages were those that managed to coordinate their evolutionary changes with environmental opportunities. They developed terrestrial capabilities just as forests were creating new ecological niches. They evolved efficient air-breathing systems just as atmospheric oxygen levels were rising. They mastered terrestrial locomotion just as environmental instability was favoring habitat generalists over specialists. This exquisite timing wasn't the result of foresight or planning. It was the inevitable outcome of natural selection operating on populations facing rapidly changing environmental conditions. The species that happened to have the right combinations of traits at the right time survived and reproduced. Those that didn't disappeared from the fossil record. But the survivors weren't just lucky. They were the products of millions of years of evolutionary preparation. The lobe-finned fish ancestors of tetrapods had been developing increasingly sophisticated limb-like fins for tens of millions of years before the transition to terrestrial life. Air-breathing capabilities had been evolving in various fish lineages since the early Devonian. The tetrapod transition wasn't a sudden leap from water to land. It was the culmination of a long series of evolutionary innovations that finally reached a critical threshold where terrestrial life became not just possible, but advantageous. Understanding this gradual nature of evolutionary change is crucial for appreciating what these ancient creatures accomplished. They weren't trying to colonize land. They weren't consciously evolving toward terrestrial life. They were simply responding to immediate survival pressures, developing whatever adaptations helped them survive and reproduce in their current environment. The fact that these immediate adaptations eventually enabled terrestrial life was an emergent property, an unintended consequence of millions of years of incremental evolutionary change. This is how evolution always works, not through grand design or long-term planning, but through the accumulation of small changes that happen to be beneficial in the short term. The late Devonian tetrapods represent evolution at its most creative and opportunistic. Faced with unprecedented environmental challenges and opportunities, natural selection crafted solutions that were both immediate responses to current problems and foundations for future evolutionary possibilities. These creatures couldn't have known that their adaptations would eventually enable their descendants to colonize every terrestrial environment on Earth. They were simply trying to survive in their own challenging world, using whatever biological tools evolution had provided them. But their success in meeting those immediate challenges created possibilities that would reshape the entire future of life on our planet. Every breath you take, every step you make, every moment of your terrestrial existence connects you to these ancient pioneers who first learned to live between two worlds. The magnitude of their achievement becomes even more impressive when we consider how many fundamental biological problems they had to solve simultaneously. Breathing air, supporting body weight against gravity, maintaining water balance, processing visual information, coordinating complex limb movements, regulating body temperature, finding and processing terrestrial food sources, navigating three-dimensional environments, and communicating in aerial environments. Each of these challenges would have been sufficient to drive major evolutionary innovation. The fact that early tetrapods solved all of them simultaneously, in the span of just a few million years, represents one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of life on Earth. Modern evolutionary biologists, working with sophisticated genetic tools and detailed knowledge of developmental biology, struggle to understand how such rapid and coordinated evolutionary change is possible. The late Devonian tetrapod radiation challenges our understanding of the mechanisms and constraints that govern evolutionary innovation. Yet the fossil evidence is unambiguous. These changes happened, they happened rapidly, and they happened successfully enough to establish terrestrial vertebrate life as a permanent feature of Earth's ecosystems. The descendants of these ancient pioneers would go on to dominate terrestrial environments, eventually giving rise to the incredible diversity of reptiles, birds, and mammals that characterize modern ecosystems. But that future success was far from certain during the late Devonian. These early tetrapods were experimental creatures, testing evolutionary solutions that had never been tried before. Many of their innovations would prove to be dead ends. Others would require millions of years of additional refinement before becoming truly effective. The fossil record shows us only the successful experiments, the lineages that managed to survive long enough to leave descendants. For every tetrapod fossil we find, there were probably dozens of species that tried and failed to make the transition to terrestrial life. This high failure rate is actually evidence of how challenging the transition was. Moving from water to land wasn't just a matter of developing limbs and lungs. It required coordinated changes across virtually every biological system, changes that had to be precisely timed and integrated to produce viable organisms. The species that succeeded weren't necessarily superior to those that failed. They were simply the ones that happened to have the right combinations of traits at the right times in the right environments. Their success was the result of evolutionary experimentation on a scale that has rarely been matched in the history of life on Earth. As we piece together this ancient story from fragmentary fossil evidence, one thing becomes abundantly clear. The transition from water to land was not inevitable. It was contingent, dependent on a specific combination of environmental conditions, evolutionary innovations, and pure chance that might never have occurred. If atmospheric oxygen levels had remained low, air breathing might never have become advantageous. If forest ecosystems had failed to develop, terrestrial food webs might never have provided sufficient resources to support vertebrate colonization. If climate had remained stable, the environmental pressures driving terrestrial adaptation might never have emerged. The fact that all these conditions aligned during the late Devonian, creating the perfect storm of evolutionary opportunity, is one of the most fortunate coincidences in the history of life. Without it, Earth might have remained a planet where complex life was restricted to aquatic environments, where intelligence never evolved, where consciousness never emerged to contemplate its own origins. But the alignment did occur, and the transition did happen. In shallow waters and on muddy shores, 400 million years ago, a few brave vertebrates took their first tentative steps into an alien world. Those steps would echo through deep time, creating ripples that would eventually reach every corner of our planet. The ripples from those first tentative steps were about to create waves that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of life itself. But before we witness the full impact of this terrestrial revolution, we need to understand just how precarious and uncertain this evolutionary experiment truly was. The late Devonian wasn't just witnessing the birth of terrestrial vertebrates. It was also experiencing one of the most severe extinction events in Earth's history. As these pioneering tetrapods were learning to breathe air and walk on land, marine ecosystems were collapsing around them. Entire groups of marine organisms that had dominated the oceans for millions of years were vanishing forever. The Frasnian-Furmenian extinction event, as paleontologists call it, was eliminating roughly 75% of all species on Earth. Tropical coral reefs disappeared almost entirely. The armored placoderm fish that had ruled the seas for over 50 million years went extinct. Brachiopods, trilobites, and countless other marine invertebrates suffered catastrophic population crashes. For the early tetrapods, this marine apocalypse was both catastrophe and opportunity. Their aquatic ancestors were dying out, making any return to purely marine lifestyles increasingly impossible. But the collapse of established marine ecosystems was also reducing competition and freeing up ecological niches that had been occupied for millions of years. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more terrifying. Just as vertebrates were developing the capability to live on land, the ocean was becoming an increasingly inhospitable place. Evolution wasn't giving these creatures a choice between aquatic and terrestrial life. It was forcing them onto land through the simple expedient of making aquatic life unsustainable. The environmental pressures driving this extinction were complex and interconnected. Massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia were pumping enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds into the atmosphere. Ocean chemistry was changing rapidly, becoming more acidic and less oxygenated. Climate was shifting from the warm, stable conditions of the Middle Devonian to the more variable and extreme conditions of the Late Devonian. For early tetrapods, these changes created a perfect storm of evolutionary pressure. Rising carbon dioxide levels were making air breathing more challenging but also more necessary as aquatic oxygen levels declined. Climate instability was creating the seasonal drying patterns that forced aquatic animals to develop terrestrial capabilities or face extinction. The fossil record from this period shows remarkable evolutionary innovation occurring at breakneck speed. Species that had remained morphologically stable for millions of years suddenly began evolving rapidly, developing new adaptations within just a few 100,000 years. This was evolution under extreme pressure, natural selection operating at maximum intensity. But not every innovation was successful. The late Devonian fossil record is littered with evolutionary dead ends. Species that developed partial terrestrial adaptations but couldn't complete the transition. Some evolved primitive limbs but retained fish-like skulls that couldn't support aerial respiration. Others developed air-breathing capabilities but lacked the skill, the differential modifications necessary for terrestrial locomotion. Between success and extinction often came down to the smallest details. The angle of a joint, the efficiency of a respiratory surface, the sensitivity of a sensory organ. These minute anatomical differences determined which lineages would survive to colonize the terrestrial world and which would disappear forever. Acanthostega represents one of the most successful of these evolutionary experiments, but its success came with surprising limitations that challenge our assumptions about early tetrapod evolution. When Jennifer Clack first began studying Acanthostega fossils in the 1980s, she expected to find a creature that was learning to walk on land. What she discovered instead revolutionized our understanding of how vertebrates made the transition from water to land. Acanthostega had 8 fully formed digits on each front limb, clear evidence of tetrapod-like appendages. Its skull was flattened and elongated, with eyes positioned on top for surface feeding. Its limb bones were robust and well developed, suggesting a creature capable of supporting its own weight. By all appearances, this was an animal that should have been competent on land. But detailed anatomical analysis revealed a creature that was entirely aquatic. The limb joints couldn't bend in the directions necessary for terrestrial locomotion. The digits were connected by extensive webbing, perfect for swimming but useless for walking. Most tellingly, Acanthostega retained internal gills and a lateral line system, clear indicators of a creature that had never left the water. This discovery forced paleontologists to completely rethink the sequence of tetrapod evolution. Limbs hadn't evolved for walking on land. They had evolved for navigating complex three-dimensional aquatic environments. The forests of the late Devonian were creating underwater habitats, unlike anything that had existed before. Fallen logs created complex mazes in shallow waters. Root systems formed intricate three-dimensional networks that required precise maneuvering to navigate. Dense aquatic vegetation created environments where swimming was less effective than careful limb-based locomotion through the underwater obstacle course. Acanthostega's 8-digit limbs were perfectly adapted for this environment. They could grip onto submerged branches, push through dense vegetation, and provide precise control in tight spaces where traditional fish locomotion would be clumsy and inefficient. These weren't proto-terrestrial limbs. They were highly specialized aquatic appendages for a new type of underwater habitat. The 8 digits themselves tell a fascinating story. Modern tetrapods are typically pentadactyl, having 5 digits on each limb. This 5-digit pattern is so fundamental to vertebrate anatomy that it appears in species as different as bats, whales, and humans. But early tetrapods experimented with different numbers of digits before settling on the 5-digit standard. Acanthostega had 8 digits on its front limbs, though the number of digits on its hind limbs remains unclear due to incomplete fossil preservation. Ichthyostega had 7 digits on its hind limbs. Other early tetrapods show evidence of 6 or even 9 digits on some appendages. This digital experimentation suggests that early tetrapod evolution was far more fluid and experimental than previously imagined. There was no predetermined body plan that evolution was working toward. Instead, different lineages were trying different solutions to the challenge of limb-based locomotion, with the 5-digit pattern eventually winning out through a combination of functional efficiency and evolutionary accident. The reduction from 8 or 7 digits to 5 probably occurred as terrestrial locomotion became more important. Fewer digits meant simpler joint mechanics, reduced energy costs for limb construction, and more efficient force transmission during weight-bearing locomotion. The 5-digit pattern represents an optimal compromise between functional capability and biological economy. But during the late Devonian, this optimization hadn't yet occurred. Early tetrapods were still in the experimental phase, trying different approaches to limb design and locomotion. Some of these experiments were remarkably successful in their specific environments, even if they ultimately proved to be evolutionary dead ends. The aquatic lifestyle of Acanthostega also helps explain another puzzling aspect of early tetrapod evolution. These creatures were developing increasingly sophisticated respiratory systems, but they were doing so while remaining entirely aquatic. Why evolve air-breathing capabilities if you're not planning to leave the water? The answer lies in understanding the environmental conditions of late Devonian aquatic habitats. The rapid evolution of forest ecosystems was dramatically changing the chemistry of freshwater environments. Decomposing plant matter was consuming enormous quantities of dissolved oxygen. Seasonal variations in water flow were creating periods when aquatic oxygen levels dropped to dangerously low concentrations. For aquatic vertebrates, air breathing wasn't preparation for terrestrial life. It was an emergency adaptation for surviving in increasingly oxygen-poor waters. The ability to gulp air at the surface could mean the difference between survival and suffocation during seasonal oxygen crashes. This interpretation explains why early tetrapods developed such sophisticated air-breathing capabilities while remaining aquatic. They weren't evolving toward terrestrial life. They were evolving toward more reliable oxygen acquisition in unpredictable aquatic environments. The dual respiratory system of early tetrapods, with both gills and lungs, represents one of the most elegant evolutionary solutions ever developed. Gills provided efficient oxygen extraction when aquatic conditions were favorable. Lungs provided backup oxygen acquisition when aquatic conditions became challenging. This redundancy offered tremendous survival advantages in the variable environments of the late Devonian. Modern lungfish demonstrate how effective this dual respiratory strategy can be. During favorable conditions, they rely primarily on their gills for respiration. But when water oxygen levels drop, or when their aquatic habitat dries up entirely, they can switch to air breathing and even survive for months in dried mud burrows. The early tetrapods were developing similar capabilities, but with more sophisticated lung structures and more efficient air-breathing mechanisms. Their respiratory systems weren't just backup options for emergency survival. They were becoming primary oxygen acquisition systems capable of supporting the high metabolic demands of active predation and complex locomotion. The transition from supplementary air breathing to primary aerial respiration required significant anatomical modifications. The internal structure of the lungs had to become more complex, with increased surface area for gas exchange. The mechanics inhalation and exhalation replacing of ventilation had to become more efficient, with active-passive gas exchange. Most importantly, the integration between respiratory and circulatory systems had to become more sophisticated. Air breathing requires more precise control of blood flow patterns, more efficient oxygen delivery to tissues, and better regulation of carbon dioxide removal from the bloodstream. The fossil evidence shows these modifications occurring gradually over millions of years. Early forms like Acanthostega show relatively simple lung structures, adequate for supplementary air breathing, but not capable of supporting purely aerial respiration. Later forms show increasingly complex respiratory systems, eventually reaching the level of sophistication necessary for fully terrestrial life. But respiratory adaptation was just one component of a much larger evolutionary transformation. The transition to terrestrial life required coordinated changes across every major organ system, modifications that had to be precisely timed and integrated to produce viable organisms. The skeletal system underwent perhaps the most dramatic changes. Fish skeletons are designed for life in a buoyant medium where gravity provides minimal structural challenges. Terrestrial skeletons must support the entire body weight against gravitational forces while still allowing efficient locomotion. The vertebral column of early tetrapods shows clear evidence of this transition. Fish vertebrae are relatively simple, uniform structures optimized for lateral flexion during swimming. Tetrapod vertebrae are more complex and specialized, with different regions adapted for different functions. The neck region develops specialized vertebrae that allow head movement independent of body orientation. This seemingly simple innovation was crucial for terrestrial life, where the ability to look around without moving the entire body provides enormous advantages for both predator detection and prey capture. The trunk region developed stronger vertebrae with more robust attachment points for limb muscles. The additional skeletal reinforcement was necessary to prevent structural failure under the increased mechanical stresses of terrestrial locomotion. The tail region shows perhaps the most dramatic changes. Fish tails are the primary propulsion organs, requiring massive muscle attachments and flexible vertebrae. Tetrapod tails become secondary structures, often serving as balance organs or fat storage sites, rather than primary locomotor organs. The limb bones themselves underwent equally dramatic modifications. Fish fin rays are thin, flexible structures optimized for steering and maneuvering in water. Tetrapod limb bones are thick, robust structures capable of supporting body weight and generating propulsive forces against solid substrates. The joints between limb bones had to become more sophisticated, with more complex articulation surfaces and more precise ranges of motion. The simple hinge joints adequate for fin movement had to evolve into the complex ball and socket, pivot and gliding joints necessary for terrestrial locomotion. Muscle arrangements also required complete reorganization. Fish locomotion relies primarily on axial muscles that produce body undulation. Tetrapod locomotion requires sophisticated appendicular muscles that can coordinate precise limb movements while maintaining body stability. The fossil record preserves evidence of these muscular changes in the form of bone surface modifications. Muscle attachment sites become more prominent and more specialized, indicating increasingly sophisticated muscular control systems. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of early tetrapod skeletal evolution is how rapidly these changes occurred. The transition from fish-like to tetrapod-like skeletal organization happened in just a few million years, an incredibly short time period by evolutionary standards. This rapid skeletal evolution was probably driven by intense environmental pressure, combined with the availability of new ecological niches. The collapse of marine ecosystems was eliminating traditional fish habitats, while the expansion of forest ecosystems was creating new terrestrial opportunities. Species that could adapt their skeletal systems quickly enough to exploit these terrestrial opportunities had enormous advantages over those that remained tied to aquatic environments. Natural selection was operating at maximum intensity, favoring any skeletal modification that improved terrestrial capability. The sensory system adaptations required for terrestrial life were equally dramatic and perhaps even more challenging to evolve. The physical properties of water and air are so different that sensory organs optimized for aquatic environments are often completely useless in terrestrial settings. Vision presents particularly complex challenges. Water and air have very different optical properties, affecting how light travels, refracts, and scatters. Eyes adapted for underwater vision don't work well in air, and vice versa. The cornea, the transparent front surface of the eye, had to undergo significant modifications. In water, the cornea provides little focusing power because its refractive index is similar to that of water. In air, the cornea becomes the primary focusing element, requiring a more curved shape and different optical properties. The lens also required modifications. Fish lenses are typically spherical and relatively inflexible, optimized for underwater focusing. Tetrapod lenses are more flattened and flexible, allowing more precise focusing in the variable optical conditions of terrestrial environments. But the most challenging aspect of visual adaptation wasn't optical, it was neural. The brain regions responsible for processing visual information had to learn to interpret entirely new types of visual stimuli. Underwater vision deals primarily with moving objects against relatively uniform backgrounds. Terrestrial vision must process complex three-dimensional scenes with multiple objects at different distances, varying lighting conditions, and complex shadow patterns. The visual processing centers in early tetrapod brains show clear evidence of expansion and reorganization. Brain cavity volumes increase significantly, particularly in regions associated with visual processing and spatial navigation. This neural expansion wasn't just about processing visual information more effectively. It was about integrating visual input with other sensory systems to create accurate three-dimensional models of terrestrial environments. Hearing underwent equally dramatic changes. The lateral line system that allows fish to detect water movement becomes completely useless in air. Early tetrapods had to evolve entirely new mechanisms for detecting airborne vibrations. The solution was ingenious in its simplicity and complexity. Bones that had originally been part of the gill support structure were gradually repurposed into sound transmission elements. The spiracle, originally a gill opening, became the eustachian tube connecting the middle ear to the throat. But this repurposing required precise coordination between multiple developmental systems. The bones had to change shape and size while maintaining their structural integrity. The surrounding soft tissues had to evolve new functions while preserving essential physiological processes. The fossil evidence shows this transformation occurring gradually over millions of years. Early forms retain the original gill support function, with only minor modifications towards sound transmission. Later forms show increasingly sophisticated middle ear structures, eventually reaching the level of complexity necessary for effective aerial hearing. Chemical sensation faced similar challenges. Aquatic chemical detection relies on dissolved molecules in water. Terrestrial chemical detection must process airborne molecules with very different physical and chemical properties. The nasal passages of early tetrapods show progressive modifications toward more efficient aerial olfaction. Internal chambers become more complex, providing greater surface area for chemical detection. Specialized regions develop for processing different types of chemical signals, but perhaps most importantly, the neural processing systems for chemical sensation had to evolve new capabilities. Airborne chemical signals provide different types of information than aquatic chemical signals, requiring new interpretive frameworks and behavioral responses. The integration of these modified sensory systems required unprecedented neural complexity. Early tetrapods weren't just processing individual sensory inputs more effectively. They were learning to integrate multiple sensory streams into coherent perceptual models of their environment. This sensory integration was crucial for terrestrial survival. Navigation in three-dimensional forest environments requires precise coordination between visual, auditory, and chemical inputs. Predator detection depends on rapid integration of multiple sensory cues. Prey capture requires real-time coordination between sensory input and motor output. The fossil evidence suggests that this sensory integration was one of the major bottlenecks in tetrapod evolution. Many lineages developed adequate individual sensory adaptations, but failed to achieve effective sensory integration. These species could survive in simple terrestrial environments, but couldn't compete effectively in the complex ecological settings of late Devonian forests. The successful lineages were those that managed to coordinate sensory and neural evolution with the anatomical changes necessary for terrestrial life. This required not just individual adaptations, but system-level coordination across multiple organ systems. The reproductive constraints facing early tetrapods created additional evolutionary challenges that wouldn't be resolved for millions of years. All early tetrapods remained dependent on aquatic environments for reproduction, regardless of their terrestrial capabilities. Fish reproduction relies on external fertilization in aquatic environments. Eggs and sperm are released into water, where they can survive and develop surrounded by a supportive medium that provides protection, nutrients, and waste removal. Terrestrial reproduction requires entirely different strategies. Eggs must be protected from desiccation while still allowing gas exchange. Developing embryos must be supplied with nutrients and protection without the buoyant support of an aquatic medium. The solution that would eventually evolve, the amniotic egg, wouldn't appear until the Carboniferous period, tens of millions of years after the first tetrapods colonized land. Until that innovation, all tetrapods remained reproductively tied to aquatic environments. This reproductive constraint had profound ecological implications. Early tetrapods couldn't establish populations in inland terrestrial environments far from water sources. They were restricted to coastal plains, river valleys, and lakeshores where aquatic breeding sites remained accessible. This geographic limitation slowed the terrestrial colonization process and created evolutionary bottlenecks during periods of environmental change. When aquatic breeding sites disappeared due to climate shifts or geological changes, entire tetrapod populations could be eliminated regardless of their terrestrial adaptations. But within these constraints, early tetrapods were remarkably successful at exploiting the ecological opportunities that terrestrial environments provided. The late Devonian fossil record shows rapid diversification in body size, ecological specialization, and geographic distribution. Some species remained primarily aquatic, using their terrestrial capabilities mainly for occasional excursions onto land. Others became predominantly terrestrial, returning to water only for reproduction. Still others occupied intermediate niches, spending roughly equal time in aquatic and terrestrial environments. This ecological flexibility was crucial for surviving the environmental instability of the late Devonian. Climate was changing rapidly, sea levels were fluctuating, and forest composition was evolving as plant communities adapted to changing conditions. Species that could exploit multiple habitat types had significant advantages over more specialized forms. When aquatic habitats became unsuitable, terrestrial capabilities provided alternative resources. When terrestrial conditions became challenging, aquatic adaptations offered refuge. This evolutionary strategy of maintaining dual capabilities would prove to be incredibly successful. Modern amphibians, despite being often dismissed as primitive evolutionary relics, actually represent one of the most successful vertebrate strategies ever developed. Amphibians have colonized virtually every terrestrial environment on Earth, from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra to desert oases. Their ability to exploit both aquatic and terrestrial resources has allowed them to persist through multiple mass extinction events and major environmental changes. But the late Devonian tetrapods were operating in a world unlike anything that exists today. The atmospheric composition was radically different, with much higher carbon dioxide levels and lower oxygen concentrations than modern environments. The plant communities were dominated by species that have no modern analogues. Giant lycophytes created forest canopies 40 meters above ground level. Primitive conifers formed dense understory thickets. The absence of flowering plants meant that ecosystem energy flows operated according to entirely different principles than modern terrestrial ecosystems. The arthropod communities that provided food sources for early tetrapods were equally alien. Millipedes the size of crocodiles processed fallen logs. Dragonflies with wingspans exceeding 60 centimeters patrolled forest clearings. Primitive arachnids, some as large as dinner plates, constructed webs that could span entire forest clearings. For early tetrapods, this represented a bonanza of unexploited food resources. These arthropods had evolved no defenses against vertebrate predation. Their behavioral patterns, protective structures, and escape responses were optimized for avoiding other arthropods, not vertebrate predators with entirely different hunting strategies. The ecological impact of vertebrate colonization on these arthropod communities was probably enormous. Predation pressure from tetrapods would have driven rapid evolutionary changes in arthropod defensive capabilities, escape behaviors, and reproductive strategies. This predator-prey arms race was probably one of the major factors driving the rapid diversification of both tetrapods and arthropods during the late Devonian. Each evolutionary innovation in predator capability would have selected for corresponding defensive innovations in prey species, creating escalating cycles of adaptation and counter-adaptation. The fossil evidence shows clear signs of this evolutionary arms race. Arthropod protective structures become more sophisticated through the late Devonian. Escape behaviors become more complex. Reproductive strategies shift toward patterns that reduce vulnerability to vertebrate predation. But the arms race wasn't one-sided. Tetrapod hunting strategies also became more sophisticated as arthropod defenses improved. Skull morphology shows increasing specialization for different types of prey. Jaw mechanics become more efficient for processing hard-bodied arthropods. Sensory systems develop enhanced capabilities for detecting and tracking prey. This evolutionary feedback loop between predators and prey created one of the most intensive periods of adaptive innovation in vertebrate history. The rate of morphological change during the late Devonian tetrapod radiation exceeds anything observed in modern ecosystems, even in the most rapidly evolving species. The environmental context driving this rapid evolution was itself rapidly changing. The late Devonian was a period of extreme climate instability, with global temperatures fluctuating dramatically and sea levels rising and falling repeatedly. These environmental changes created constantly shifting selection pressures. Traits that were advantageous during warm, wet periods might become liabilities during cool, dry periods. Species had to evolve rapidly just to keep pace with changing environmental conditions. The most successful tetrapod lineages were those that maintained genetic and phenotypic flexibility, allowing rapid adaptation to changing conditions. This probably required maintaining larger population sizes and more genetic diversity than would be necessary in stable environments. The fossil record suggests that tetrapod populations during the late Devonian were characterized by high levels of morphological variation within species. This variation provided the raw material for rapid evolutionary response when environmental conditions changed. But maintaining this flexibility came at significant evolutionary costs. High levels of genetic variation can reduce average fitness in stable environments. The energy costs of maintaining developmental flexibility can limit growth rates and reproductive success. The fact that late Devonian tetrapods were willing to pay these evolutionary costs suggests that environmental instability was the dominant selective pressure they faced. Adaptation to current conditions was less important than maintaining the capacity to adapt to future conditions. This evolutionary strategy proved to be remarkably successful. The tetrapod lineages that survived the late Devonian environmental upheavals went on to dominate terrestrial ecosystems for the next 400 million years. But survival wasn't guaranteed. The late Devonian extinction event eliminated many tetrapod lineages, along with the marine species that received more attention from paleontologists. The transition to terrestrial life provided some protection from marine environmental catastrophes, but it didn't guarantee survival. The tetrapod species that did survive were those that happened to have the right combinations of adaptations for the specific environmental challenges of the end-Devonian crisis. Their success wasn't necessarily due to superior design or greater evolutionary sophistication. It was often simply a matter of being in the right place at the right time with the right set of traits. This contingent nature of evolutionary success is one of the most important lessons from the late Devonian tetrapod radiation. Evolution doesn't produce optimal solutions or guarantee progress toward greater complexity or capability. It simply favors whatever traits happen to be useful in current environmental conditions. The fact that tetrapod terrestrial adaptations proved to be successful in the long term was largely a matter of evolutionary luck. If environmental conditions had evolved differently, the same adaptations might have proven to be liabilities rather than assets. Understanding this contingent nature of evolutionary success helps us appreciate just how remarkable the tetrapod transition actually was. These creatures weren't following some predetermined evolutionary program toward terrestrial life. They were responding to immediate environmental pressures with whatever biological tools were available to them. The fact that their responses happened to create the foundation for all future terrestrial vertebrate evolution was an emergent property, an unintended consequence of short-term survival strategies. This is both humbling and inspiring. It reminds us that the most profound evolutionary innovations often arise from the most mundane survival challenges. The late Devonian tetrapods were simply trying to find enough food, avoid being eaten, and reproduce successfully in a challenging and rapidly changing environment. The fact that their solutions to these immediate problems would eventually enable their descendants to colonize every terrestrial environment on Earth was beyond their comprehension or intention. Yet their success in meeting immediate challenges created possibilities that would reshape the entire trajectory of life on our planet. The ripple effects of their evolutionary innovations are still playing out today, 400 million years later, in every terrestrial ecosystem on Earth. Every time you watch a bird soar through the sky, you're seeing the refined descendant of innovations first developed by late Devonian tetrapods. Every time you observe a mammal running across open ground, you're witnessing the expression of genetic and developmental programs that trace their origins back to these ancient pioneers. The connection between those first tentative steps onto late Devonian mudflats and the complex terrestrial ecosystems of today is direct and unbroken. The same basic body plan, the same fundamental physiological systems, the same core adaptations that enabled terrestrial life 400 million years ago continue to enable terrestrial life today. This evolutionary continuity is one of the most remarkable aspects of the tetrapod story. Despite 400 million years of subsequent evolution, despite countless environmental changes and evolutionary innovations, the basic solutions developed by late Devonian tetrapods remain the foundation of terrestrial vertebrate life. The four-limbed body plan has never been fundamentally altered. The dual respiratory system combining lungs and cutaneous gas exchange persists in modern amphibians. The complex middle ear system traces its origins directly back to late Devonian innovations. The visual system adaptations that enabled terrestrial sight remain essentially unchanged in modern vertebrates. This evolutionary conservatism reflects the fundamental effectiveness of the late Devonian solutions. When evolution finds solutions that work well, it tends to preserve them across geological timescales. The fact that tetrapod terrestrial adaptations have remained largely unchanged for 400 million years testifies to their elegant efficiency. But this conservatism also reflects the enormous evolutionary constraints imposed by having a successful body plan. Once vertebrates had committed to the tetrapod design, changing it became increasingly difficult as more and more biological systems became integrated around that basic framework. Every subsequent evolutionary innovation had to work within the constraints of the four-limbed, air-breathing, terrestrial body plan established during the late Devonian. This created both opportunities and limitations that continue to shape vertebrate evolution today. The opportunities were enormous. The basic tetrapod toolkit was flexible enough to be modified for an incredible diversity of lifestyles. The same fundamental limb structure that enabled walking on late Devonian mudflats would eventually be modified for running, jumping, climbing, flying, swimming, and digging. The four limbs of early tetrapods became the wings of birds, the flippers of whales, the arms and legs of primates, and the specialized appendages of countless other vertebrate groups. The lungs that first extracted oxygen from late Devonian air became the sophisticated respiratory systems that enable the high-energy lifestyles of modern birds and mammals. The visual system that first processed the three-dimensional complexity of ancient forests became the foundation for the acute eyesight of raptors, the color discrimination of primates, and the motion detection capabilities of countless predator species. But the constraints were equally significant. The four-limbed body plan, however successful, imposed fundamental limitations on what vertebrates could become. Unlike arthropods, which can evolve additional limbs for specialized functions, tetrapods were locked into working with just 4 appendages. This constraint meant that any specialized function requiring limb modification had to come at the cost of other capabilities. Birds gained the ability to fly, but lost the ability to manipulate objects with their forelimbs. Whales gained swimming efficiency, but lost terrestrial mobility entirely. The respiratory system innovations of early tetrapods created similar constraints. The dual system of lungs and gills that worked so well for late Devonian species became increasingly difficult to maintain as terrestrial specialization progressed. Modern amphibians represent the last vertebrates to retain significant cutaneous respiration, and even they have largely abandoned true gills. The sensory system adaptations that enabled terrestrial life created their own evolutionary trajectories. Once vertebrates had committed to processing visual, auditory, and chemical information in air rather than water, returning to purely aquatic lifestyles required significant readaptation. The whales and dolphins that returned to marine environments had to evolve entirely new sensory capabilities like echolocation because their terrestrial sensory heritage was poorly suited to aquatic life. The visual systems that worked well in air required major modifications to function underwater. The hearing systems adapted for aerial sound transmission had to be completely reorganized for underwater acoustic detection. These evolutionary constraints help explain why the transition from water to land was such a profound evolutionary event. It wasn't just a change in habitat, it was a fundamental commitment to a particular way of being a vertebrate, a decision that would influence every aspect of vertebrate evolution for the next 400 million years. The late Devonian tetrapods couldn't have anticipated the long-term consequences of their terrestrial adaptations. They were simply responding to immediate environmental pressures with whatever biological tools evolution provided. But their short-term solutions created long-term evolutionary trajectories that continue to shape vertebrate diversity today. Understanding this helps us appreciate the true magnitude of what these ancient creatures accomplished. They weren't just learning to live on land. They were establishing the fundamental parameters within which all future terrestrial vertebrate evolution would occur. The ecosystem impacts of vertebrate terrestrial colonization extended far beyond the vertebrates themselves. The entry of sophisticated predators into terrestrial food webs created cascading effects that transformed entire ecological communities. Before vertebrate colonization, terrestrial ecosystems were dominated by arthropods and primitive plants. Energy flows were relatively simple, with most primary productivity being processed by detritivorous arthropods and their arthropod predators. The addition of vertebrate predators created entirely new energy transfer pathways. Vertebrates could access energy sources that had been unavailable to arthropod predators. They could process larger prey items, exploit resources at different spatial and temporal scales, and create new selective pressures throughout the ecosystem. The impact on arthropod communities was probably dramatic and immediate. Predation pressure from vertebrates would have driven rapid evolutionary changes in arthropod defensive capabilities, reproductive strategies, and ecological distributions. Some arthropod groups probably benefited from vertebrate colonization. Small arthropods that were too small to be worthwhile prey for vertebrates might have experienced reduced competition as larger arthropods faced increased predation pressure. But the overall effect was probably to increase the complexity and energy flow efficiency of terrestrial ecosystems. Vertebrate predators could capture energy from arthropod communities and make it available to decomposer organisms through waste products and eventual death. This increased energy flow complexity created opportunities for further ecological diversification. More complex food webs could support greater species diversity and more specialized ecological roles. The plant communities of late Devonian forests were also affected by vertebrate colonization, though these effects were probably more subtle and took longer to manifest. Vertebrate waste products provided new nutrient sources for plant communities. Vertebrate movement patterns created new seed dispersal pathways. More importantly, the increased complexity of terrestrial food webs created new selective pressures for plant defensive and reproductive strategies. Plants that could better defend themselves against herbivorous arthropods, or that could better exploit vertebrate seed dispersal capabilities, would have had advantages over less adaptable species. These ecological effects of vertebrate terrestrial colonization continued to ramify through late Devonian and Carboniferous ecosystems, ultimately contributing to the establishment of the complex terrestrial food webs that characterize modern ecosystems. But the immediate ecological impacts were probably less important than the long-term evolutionary consequences. The establishment of vertebrates as terrestrial predators created entirely new evolutionary possibilities that wouldn't be fully realized for millions of years. The late Devonian vertebrates were laying the groundwork for future evolutionary innovations, like powered flight, complex social behaviors, and eventually intelligence and consciousness. These capabilities were implicit in the terrestrial adaptations developed during the late Devonian, but they wouldn't become explicit until much later in evolutionary history. The neural complexity required for terrestrial sensory integration created the foundation for more sophisticated cognitive capabilities. The metabolic efficiency required for terrestrial locomotion created the foundation for the high-energy lifestyles that would eventually enable complex behaviors and large brain sizes. The social opportunities created by terrestrial habitats provided the foundation for the complex social systems that would eventually characterize many vertebrate groups. Territorial behaviors, mating displays, and cooperative interactions all became possible in ways that had no aquatic precedents. These emergent properties of terrestrial life weren't apparent during the late Devonian. The early tetrapods were focused on immediate survival challenges, not long-term evolutionary possibilities. But their solutions to immediate problems created the conditions that would eventually enable extraordinary evolutionary innovations. The fossil evidence from the late Devonian shows us vertebrates at a unique moment in evolutionary history, poised between their aquatic past and their terrestrial future. These creatures had developed many of the key adaptations necessary for terrestrial life, but they hadn't yet realized the full potential of those adaptations. They were still reproductively tied to aquatic environments. Their terrestrial locomotor capabilities were still relatively primitive. Their ecological roles were still largely similar to those of their aquatic ancestors. They were predators and scavengers, not yet the ecosystem engineers that vertebrates would eventually become. But the foundation was in place. The basic body plan was established. The fundamental physiological systems were functional. The sensory and neural capabilities necessary for terrestrial life were operational. All the pieces were assembled for the next phase of vertebrate evolution, the Carboniferous period expansion that would see vertebrates truly master terrestrial environments and begin the diversification that would eventually produce the incredible variety of terrestrial vertebrate life we see today. The late Devonian tetrapods represent evolution at its most creative and opportunistic. Faced with unprecedented environmental challenges, natural selection crafted solutions that were both immediate responses to current problems and foundations for future evolutionary possibilities. These ancient creatures couldn't have known that their adaptations would eventually enable their descendants to colonize every terrestrial environment on Earth, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests to high mountain peaks. They were simply trying to survive in their own challenging world. But their success in meeting immediate survival challenges created ripple effects that continue to shape life on Earth today. Every terrestrial vertebrate alive today, from the smallest shrew to the largest elephant, carries within its body the genetic and developmental legacy of those first brave pioneers who learned to breathe air and walk on land 400 million years ago. The transition from water to land represents one of the most profound evolutionary innovations in the history of life on Earth. It opened up entirely new realms of possibility, created opportunities for evolutionary innovations that had never existed before, and established the foundation for the complex terrestrial ecosystems that characterize our modern world. Understanding this transition helps us appreciate both the continuity and the creativity of evolutionary processes. The same basic mechanisms of genetic variation and natural selection that operated during the late Devonian continue to operate today, constantly creating new solutions to environmental challenges and opening up new evolutionary possibilities. The story of the first animals that walked on land isn't just ancient history. It's an ongoing process, a continuous exploration of what it means to be alive in a world where land and water, stability and change, constraint and opportunity exist in dynamic tension. Every step you take connects you directly to those first tentative steps taken on late Devonian mudflats 400 million years ago. Every breath you take utilizes respiratory mechanisms first developed by creatures learning to extract oxygen from ancient air. Every visual scene you process uses neural pathways first established by vertebrates learning to see in three-dimensional terrestrial environments. The legacy of the first landwalkers lives on not just in the fossil record, but in the fundamental architecture of every terrestrial vertebrate body, including your own. Their evolutionary innovations didn't just enable terrestrial life, they defined what terrestrial life would become, establishing patterns and possibilities that continue to unfold across geological time. In the shallow waters and muddy shores of the late Devonian, evolution was writing the first chapter of a story that continues today. The protagonists of that ancient drama couldn't have imagined where their story would lead, but their courage in taking those first steps into an unknown world created the foundation for everything that followed. The ripples from their evolutionary leap continue to spread across deep time, creating waves of possibility that will continue to shape the future of life on Earth for millions of years to come. In their tentative steps onto ancient shores, we see not just the beginning of terrestrial vertebrate life, but a testament to the endless creativity and possibility inherent in the evolutionary process itself. The transformation wasn't just happening in individual creatures. It was reshaping the very concept of what life could become. As these pioneering tetrapods spread across the late Devonian landscape, they were unconsciously conducting the greatest biological experiment in Earth's history. Each generation was testing new possibilities, pushing the boundaries of vertebrate existence further than they had ever been pushed before. But success bred competition. As more lineages mastered the delicate balance between aquatic and terrestrial life, the stakes kept rising. The easy pickings of the earliest terrestrial colonization were disappearing. Arthropod prey species were evolving better defenses, more sophisticated escape behaviors, more efficient reproductive strategies to compensate for vertebrate predation. The evolutionary arms race was accelerating. Tetrapod hunting strategies became more refined. Skull shapes diversified to exploit different prey types. Some species developed crushing jaws perfect for processing hard-shelled arthropods. Others evolved slicing dentition optimized for soft-bodied prey. Still others became generalists, capable of processing whatever food sources were available. The fossil record from this period reveals an explosion of morphological diversity that rivals anything in vertebrate evolutionary history. Within just a few million years, tetrapods had diversified into ecological roles that wouldn't be filled again until after the Permian extinction. Over 100 million years later, some species became the first vertebrate ambush predators, hiding motionless in shallow water until unwary arthropods ventured within striking distance. Their flattened skulls and dorsally positioned eyes were perfectly adapted for this lifestyle, allowing them to remain virtually invisible while monitoring the surface above. Others became active pursuit predators, using their improved terrestrial locomotion to chase down prey across mudflats and through forest undergrowth. These species developed more robust limb bones, more efficient joint mechanics, and more sophisticated sensory systems for tracking moving targets. Still others explored the possibilities of scavenging in terrestrial environments. The late Devonian forests were producing enormous quantities of dead plant material, fallen logs, and decomposing organic matter that supported vast arthropod communities. Scavenging tetrapods could exploit these resources without the energetic costs of active predation. The diversity of ecological strategies emerging during this period reflects the unprecedented nature of terrestrial vertebrate colonization. There were no established rules, no proven strategies, no evolutionary templates to follow. Every species was experimenting, trying new approaches, testing the limits of what was possible. Some experiments were remarkably successful. The basic ambush predator strategy pioneered by late Devonian tetrapods would persist virtually unchanged in crocodilians for the next 400 million years. The active pursuit strategies developed by other lineages would eventually evolve into the sophisticated hunting behaviors of mammals and birds. But many experiments failed spectacularly. The fossil record is littered with tetrapod lineages that developed highly specialized adaptations that proved to be evolutionary dead ends. Species that became too specialized for specific prey types went extinct when those prey species evolved effective defenses. Species that became too dependent on specific environmental conditions disappeared when those conditions changed. The survivors weren't necessarily the most specialized or the most sophisticated. They were the most flexible, the most capable of adapting to changing conditions, the most able to exploit new opportunities as they arose. This pattern of evolutionary experimentation and selection would define vertebrate evolution for millions of years to come. The late Devonian was establishing not just the anatomical foundations of terrestrial vertebrate life, but also the evolutionary strategies that would guide future vertebrate diversification. The environmental context supporting this evolutionary explosion was itself undergoing rapid change. The late Devonian climate was becoming increasingly unstable, with dramatic swings between greenhouse and icehouse conditions. Sea levels rose and fell repeatedly, creating and destroying coastal habitats with unprecedented frequency. For tetrapods, this environmental instability created both challenges and opportunities. Species that were too specialized for specific environmental conditions faced repeated extinction risks. But species that could exploit multiple habitat types had access to refugia during environmental crises and new opportunities during environmental recoveries. The most successful tetrapod lineages were those that maintained what evolutionary biologists call phenotypic plasticity, the ability to modify their morphology and behavior in response to environmental conditions. This flexibility came at significant metabolic costs, but it provided insurance against environmental unpredictability. Modern amphibians demonstrate how effective this strategy can be. Despite facing habitat destruction, climate change, pollution and disease, amphibians as a group have shown remarkable resilience. Their ability to exploit both aquatic and terrestrial resources, to modify their behavior in response to environmental conditions, and to survive in marginal habitats has allowed them to persist through multiple environmental crises. The late Devonian tetrapods were developing similar capabilities, but in a world where environmental change was occurring at geological rather than ecological timescales. The selective pressures they faced were more intense and more sustained than anything modern species experience. Ocean chemistry was shifting as atmospheric carbon dioxide levels fluctuated. Terrestrial plant communities were evolving rapidly as forest ecosystems matured. Arthropod communities were undergoing their own evolutionary radiations in response to both environmental change and vertebrate predation pressure. The result was an environment of unprecedented evolutionary opportunity and challenge. Species that could adapt rapidly to changing conditions had access to new ecological niches and reduced competition. Species that couldn't adapt quickly enough faced extinction. The fossil evidence suggests that tetrapod evolution during this period was characterized by rapid bursts of morphological change, followed by periods of relative stability. This pattern, which paleontologists call punctuated equilibrium, reflects the episodic nature of environmental change during the late Devonian. Each major environmental shift created new selective pressures and new evolutionary opportunities. The species that survived these transitions were those that happened to have the right combinations of traits for the new environmental conditions. Their success often had as much to do with evolutionary luck as with superior adaptation. But luck favored the prepared. The tetrapod lineages that had invested in maintaining genetic and phenotypic flexibility were more likely to have useful traits available when environmental conditions changed. The species that had developed broad ecological tolerances were more likely to survive habitat disruptions. The integration of multiple organ systems required for terrestrial life created evolutionary constraints that limited how rapidly tetrapods could respond to environmental change. Unlike single-celled organisms that can evolve new capabilities within generations, complex multicellular organisms require coordinated changes across multiple developmental systems. This constraint meant that tetrapod evolution occurred in discrete pulses rather than continuous gradual change. Each evolutionary pulse corresponded to a period when multiple organ systems could be modified simultaneously without compromising organismal viability. The late Devonian represents perhaps the most intensive of these evolutionary pulses in vertebrate history. The environmental pressures driving terrestrial adaptation were so intense that they overcame the normal evolutionary constraints, limiting the rate of complex morphological change. The result was an unprecedented episode of evolutionary innovation that established the basic framework for all subsequent terrestrial vertebrate evolution. The solutions developed during this period were so effective that they've remained largely unchanged for 400 million years. This evolutionary conservatism reflects both the elegance of the late Devonian innovations and the constraints they created for future evolution. Once vertebrates had committed to the tetrapod body plan, changing it became increasingly difficult as more biological systems became integrated around that framework. Every subsequent evolutionary innovation had to work within the constraints of four-limbed, air-breathing terrestrial existence. This created both remarkable opportunities and significant limitations that continue to shape vertebrate evolution today. The neural innovations required for terrestrial life were perhaps the most profound and far-reaching of all the late Devonian adaptations. Processing sensory information in three-dimensional terrestrial environments required entirely new types of neural computation. Aquatic environments are relatively simple from a cognitive perspective. Movement is primarily two-dimensional, with vertical movement being limited by depth constraints. Visual scenes are relatively uniform, dominated by moving objects against relatively featureless backgrounds. Navigation relies heavily on chemical gradients and water currents that provide reliable directional information. Terrestrial environments are cognitively much more demanding. Movement occurs in three dimensions with complex interactions between gravity, friction, and momentum. Visual scenes are incredibly complex, with multiple objects at different distances, variable lighting conditions, and intricate shadow patterns that can conceal both predators and prey. Navigation requires integrating multiple sensory inputs to create accurate spatial maps of complex three-dimensional environments. Memory becomes crucial for remembering the locations of resources, territories, and dangers across landscapes that can span kilometers. The neural processing capabilities required for terrestrial life represented a quantum leap in vertebrate cognitive evolution. Brain sizes increased dramatically during the late Devonian, particularly in regions associated with sensory processing, spatial navigation, and motor control. This neural expansion wasn't just about processing individual sensory inputs more effectively. It was about developing entirely new types of cognitive capabilities that had no aquatic precedents. Spatial reasoning became essential for navigation in complex forest environments. Memory systems had to evolve to store and retrieve information about territorial boundaries, resource locations, and seasonal patterns. Decision-making systems had to develop to choose between multiple behavioral options in rapidly changing situations. The fossil evidence shows progressive increases in brain cavity volumes throughout the late Devonian, indicating that neural evolution was keeping pace with the anatomical and physiological changes required for terrestrial life. But perhaps most importantly, these neural innovations were creating the cognitive foundation for all future vertebrate behavioral complexity. The spatial reasoning capabilities first developed for forest navigation would eventually enable complex social behaviors, tool use, and abstract thinking. The memory systems first developed for remembering resource locations would eventually enable cultural transmission, learning from experience, and planning for future events. The decision-making systems first developed for choosing between immediate behavioral options would eventually enable complex problem-solving, creative thinking, and consciousness itself. These cognitive capabilities were implicit in the neural innovations of late Devonian tetrapods, but they wouldn't become explicit until much later in evolutionary history. The early tetrapods were laying the neural groundwork for capabilities they couldn't have imagined. The social implications of terrestrial life were also beginning to emerge during the late Devonian, though they wouldn't be fully realized for millions of years. Aquatic vertebrates have relatively limited opportunities for complex social interactions due to the physical properties of their environment. Sound transmission in water limits the range and complexity of acoustic communication. Chemical communication through pheromones is effective, but relatively slow and non-specific. Visual communication is limited by the optical properties of water and the typically uniform nature of aquatic environments. Terrestrial environments offer unprecedented opportunities for social communication and interaction. Sound travels differently in air, allowing for more complex and longer-range acoustic signals. Visual communication becomes more effective due to the superior optical properties of air and the complex three-dimensional structure of terrestrial environments. Chemical communication remains effective, but operates according to different principles, with airborne chemical signals providing different types of information than aquatic chemical signals. The late Devonian tetrapods were beginning to explore these new communicative possibilities, though their social behaviors remained relatively simple compared to what would eventually evolve. The fossil evidence suggests that some species were developing territorial behaviors, with individuals defending specific areas against conspecifics. Skull modifications in some lineages suggest the beginnings of visual display structures, possibly used for species recognition or mate selection. Acoustic communication was probably in its earliest stages, with simple vocalizations used for basic territorial or reproductive signaling. The anatomical prerequisites for more complex vocalizations were developing, but sophisticated acoustic communication wouldn't emerge until much later. But the foundation was being laid for the complex social systems that would eventually characterize many terrestrial vertebrate groups. The cognitive capabilities required for terrestrial navigation were creating the neural infrastructure necessary for social cognition. The environmental structure of terrestrial habitats was providing opportunities for territorial and social organization that had no aquatic precedents. The reproductive constraints that kept early tetrapods tied to aquatic environments were also influencing their social evolution. The need to return to water for breeding created opportunities for social aggregation during reproductive seasons. These temporary social aggregations may have provided the first opportunities for complex social interactions among terrestrial vertebrates. Competition for breeding sites, mate selection, and parental care behaviors could all have begun to evolve during these aquatic reproductive phases. The fossil record provides limited direct evidence for late Devonian tetrapod social behaviors, but the anatomical changes occurring during this period strongly suggest that the foundations of vertebrate social evolution were being established. The metabolic innovations required for terrestrial life were creating the energetic foundation for more complex behaviors. The neural innovations required for terrestrial navigation were creating the cognitive foundation for social cognition. The environmental opportunities provided by terrestrial habitats were creating the ecological foundation for social organization. These foundations wouldn't support complex social systems for millions of years, but they were essential prerequisites for all future vertebrate social evolution. The late Devonian tetrapods were unconsciously creating the biological infrastructure that would eventually enable everything from bird flocks to mammalian societies to human civilizations. The global impact of vertebrate terrestrial colonization extended far beyond the immediate effects on terrestrial ecosystems. The establishment of efficient terrestrial food webs was beginning to alter global biogeochemical cycles in ways that would have profound long-term consequences. Vertebrate waste products were introducing new types of nutrients into terrestrial environments. The nitrogen and phosphorus cycling patterns that had been established by arthropod-dominated ecosystems were being modified by vertebrate metabolism and excretion patterns. These changes were subtle initially, but they were beginning to alter soil chemistry, plant growth patterns, and overall ecosystem productivity in ways that would compound over geological timescales. The increased efficiency of energy transfer through terrestrial food webs was also beginning to affect carbon cycling. More efficient predation was reducing the standing biomass of herbivorous arthropods, potentially affecting the rate of plant material consumption and decomposition. These early modifications to global biogeochemical cycles were creating feedback loops with atmospheric and oceanic systems. Changes in terrestrial carbon storage were beginning to influence atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, which in turn affected global climate patterns. The late Devonian tetrapods couldn't have anticipated these global-scale effects of their terrestrial colonization, but their ecological success was beginning to influence planetary systems in ways that would continue to ramify for hundreds of millions of years. The establishment of vertebrates as major components of terrestrial ecosystems was also beginning to influence the evolution of terrestrial plant communities. Plants that could better defend themselves against vertebrate herbivory, or that could better exploit vertebrate seed dispersal capabilities, were gaining advantages over less adaptable species. These plant evolutionary responses were subtle during the late Devonian, because early tetrapods were primarily carnivorous, but they were setting the stage for the much more dramatic plant-vertebrate co-evolutionary interactions that would characterize later periods. The late Devonian was thus witnessing the beginning of the complex ecological interactions that would eventually characterize mature terrestrial ecosystems. The entry of vertebrates into terrestrial food webs was creating new selective pressures, new evolutionary opportunities, and new ecological possibilities that would continue to unfold for hundreds of millions of years. But perhaps most importantly, the late Devonian tetrapods were demonstrating the incredible creative potential of evolutionary processes when faced with unprecedented environmental challenges and opportunities. The transition from water to land required solutions to biological problems that had never been faced before in the history of life on Earth. The evolutionary responses to these challenges were remarkably elegant, creating integrated biological systems that were both immediately effective and evolutionarily flexible. The same basic anatomical, physiological, and neural innovations that enabled late Devonian tetrapods to survive on ancient mudflats would eventually enable their descendants to colonize every terrestrial environment on Earth, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests to high mountain peaks. The metabolic innovations that supported terrestrial locomotion would eventually enable the high-energy lifestyles of flying birds and running mammals. The neural innovations that supported terrestrial navigation would eventually enable complex problem-solving, social cooperation, and conscious thought. The reproductive constraints that initially limited tetrapods to aquatic breeding sites would eventually drive the evolution of terrestrial reproduction, freeing vertebrates from their ancestral dependence on water and enabling the colonization of truly terrestrial environments. Every aspect of modern terrestrial vertebrate biology can be traced back to innovations first developed during the late Devonian transition from water to land. The solutions developed by these ancient pioneers established the evolutionary trajectory that all subsequent terrestrial vertebrates would follow. This remarkable continuity across 400 million years of evolutionary history testifies to the fundamental effectiveness of the late Devonian innovations. Evolution rarely preserves biological solutions across such vast timescales unless they are exceptionally well adapted to their functional requirements. The fact that the basic tetrapod body plan, the fundamental physiological systems, and the core sensory adaptations developed during the late Devonian remain essentially unchanged in modern vertebrates demonstrates that these ancient creatures succeeded in finding optimal solutions to the challenges of terrestrial life. But their success wasn't guaranteed. The late Devonian was a period of intense environmental instability, massive extinction events, and unprecedented evolutionary pressure. Many lineages that attempted the transition to terrestrial life failed completely, leaving no descendants and only fragmentary fossil evidence of their existence. The tetrapod lineages that survived and flourished were those that happened to develop the right combinations of traits at the right times in the right environments. Their success was the result of evolutionary experimentation on a scale that has rarely been equaled in the history of life on Earth. Understanding the contingent nature of this evolutionary success helps us appreciate both the remarkable achievements of late Devonian tetrapods and the broader patterns that govern evolutionary innovation. Evolution doesn't work toward predetermined goals or follow predetermined pathways. It simply favors whatever traits happen to be useful in current environmental conditions. The fact that the traits favored during the late Devonian happened to create the foundation for all future terrestrial vertebrate evolution was largely a matter of evolutionary fortune. But fortune favored those lineages that had invested in evolutionary flexibility, broad ecological tolerance, and integrated biological systems capable of functioning effectively across multiple environmental conditions. The late Devonian tetrapods succeeded not because they were trying to colonize terrestrial environments, but because they had developed biological capabilities that happened to be useful when terrestrial environments became available for colonization. Their story reminds us that the most profound evolutionary innovations often arise from the most immediate survival challenges. These ancient creatures were simply trying to find food, avoid predators, and reproduce successfully in a rapidly changing world. The fact that their solutions to these immediate problems would eventually enable their descendants to master terrestrial environments, develop complex societies, and ultimately gain the cognitive capabilities necessary to understand their own evolutionary history was beyond their comprehension or intention. Yet their success in meeting immediate survival challenges created ripple effects that continue to shape life on Earth today. Every terrestrial vertebrate alive today, from the smallest mouse to the largest elephant, carries within its body the genetic and developmental legacy of those first brave pioneers who learned to breathe air and walk on solid ground. The transition from water to land wasn't just an event in ancient history. It was the beginning of an ongoing evolutionary experiment that continues to unfold today. The same basic mechanisms of genetic variation and natural selection that enabled late Devonian tetrapods to colonize terrestrial environments continue to operate today, constantly creating new adaptations and new possibilities. Modern vertebrates continue to explore the evolutionary potential first unlocked by their late Devonian ancestors. Birds have taken vertebrate evolution into the aerial realm, developing powered flight and exploring three-dimensional environments in ways that early tetrapods could never have imagined. Marine mammals have returned to aquatic environments, but with terrestrial evolutionary heritage that enables capabilities no purely aquatic vertebrate ever developed. Whales and dolphins have evolved echolocation systems that surpass anything in the aquatic realm, combining terrestrial neural complexity with aquatic environmental expertise. Primates have explored the cognitive potential implicit in the neural innovations of early tetrapods, developing complex social systems, cultural transmission, tool use, and ultimately the capacity for abstract thought and scientific understanding. Each of these evolutionary innovations builds on the foundation established during the late Devonian transition from water to land. The basic body plan, the fundamental physiological systems, and the core cognitive capabilities that enable these remarkable adaptations all trace their origins back to those ancient mudflats. where vertebrates first learned to live between two worlds. The story of the first animals that walked on land is thus not just an episode in ancient natural history. It's the origin story of terrestrial life itself, the foundational moment that established the evolutionary possibilities that continue to unfold around us today. Every step you take, every breath you draw, every thought you think connects you directly to those pioneering creatures who first ventured onto late Devonian shores 400 million years ago. Their courage in facing an unknown world, their success in solving unprecedented biological challenges, and their legacy in establishing the foundation for all future terrestrial life make them among the most important organisms in the history of our planet. In the end, their story is our story. Their evolutionary journey became our evolutionary heritage. Their ancient experiment in terrestrial living became the template for everything that terrestrial vertebrate life would eventually become. The ripples from their first tentative steps onto ancient land continue to spread across deep time, creating waves of possibility that will shape the future of life on Earth for millions of years to come. In their remarkable transition from water to land, we see not just the birth of terrestrial vertebrate life, but a testament to the endless creativity and transformative power of evolution itself. The story we've been tracing across hundreds of millions of years was about to reach its most crucial turning point. These ancient pioneers had spent eons preparing for a moment they couldn't possibly comprehend, developing tools they didn't know they'd need, solving problems they hadn't yet encountered. The stage was set for vertebrate life to make its boldest gamble yet. Picture yourself standing on the shores of an ancient lake 360 million years ago. The water is murky, choked with decaying plant matter. The oxygen levels are dropping. Fish are gasping at the surface, their gills working frantically to extract what little dissolved oxygen remains. Most will die here, victims of an environment that's changing faster than they can adapt. But watch that creature there, half hidden in the shallows. Its name is Ichthyostega, and it's about to make a decision that will echo through eternity. Its powerful front limbs push against the muddy bottom. Its head breaks the surface, and primitive lungs fill with air. For a moment, it hesitates at the boundary between two worlds. Then it hauls itself forward. Water streams from its body as gravity takes hold for the first time in vertebrate history. Its seven-toed feet find purchase on solid ground. It's clumsy, awkward, dragging its body like a living fossil pulled from the depths of time. But it's walking, sort of. This isn't the graceful locomotion we associate with modern land animals. Recent biomechanical studies have revealed that Ichthyostega moved more like a seal than a lizard, using its powerful front limbs to drag its body forward while its hind legs provided minimal support. Its joints lacked the mobility for true tetrapod walking. Its hips couldn't rotate properly. Its stride was more of a controlled fall than coordinated movement. But it was enough. In that clumsy, desperate scramble across late Devonian mud, Ichthyostega was writing the first page of terrestrial vertebrate history. Every step was a small victory against 4 billion years of aquatic evolution. Every breath was a declaration that life refused to be confined by the boundaries that had seemed absolute. The world Ichthyostega entered was both paradise and nightmare. Oxygen levels were rising but still far below modern concentrations. The air itself was thick with carbon dioxide, creating a greenhouse atmosphere that would challenge any modern organism. Daily temperature swings were extreme, without large bodies of water to buffer thermal variations. The landscape was dominated by forests unlike anything on Earth today. Towering lycophytes stretched 40 meters into the sky, their scale-covered trunks supporting crowns of primitive leaves. These weren't trees in the modern sense. They were giant relatives of club mosses, evolutionary experiments in vertical growth that would eventually collapse under their own limitations. Beneath these ancient giants, the forest of decomposing plant floor was a carpet matter, primitive mosses, and early ferns. There was no grass, no flowers, no familiar understory vegetation. The ground was often boggy, waterlogged, treacherous underfoot. Fallen logs created natural bridges and barriers, forming a three-dimensional maze that challenged every aspect of terrestrial locomotion. But for a creature learning to navigate this alien landscape, the challenges were matched by unprecedented opportunities. The arthropod communities that had evolved in these forests had never faced vertebrate predation. Millipedes the size of modern crocodiles processed rotting logs with no awareness that death might approach on 4 legs. Giant dragonflies with wingspans approaching a meter patrolled the canopy, their compound eyes scanning for threats that moved like them, not like the lumbering vertebrates emerging from the waters below. Early spiders, some as large as dinner plates, constructed webs that could span entire clearings. Their silk was strong enough to stop flying arthropods, but had never been tested against the jaws of a vertebrate predator. Primitive arachnids scuttled through the leaf litter, their behavioral patterns optimized for avoiding other arthropods, not the entirely different threat represented by vertebrate hunters. For Ichthyostega and its contemporaries, this represented a biological gold rush. Here were energy sources that no vertebrate had ever exploited, prey species with no defenses against vertebrate attack patterns, ecological niches waiting to be filled by any creature capable of exploiting them. But success wasn't guaranteed. The fossil record from this period shows numerous evolutionary experiments that failed spectacularly. Some tetrapods developed specialized feeding adaptations that proved too narrow when prey species evolved defenses. Others became so dependent on specific environmental conditions that they couldn't survive when those conditions changed. The survivors were those that maintained flexibility, that could adapt their hunting strategies as prey species evolved better defenses, that could exploit multiple food sources as environmental conditions shifted. Ichthyostega represents one of these successful experiments, a creature that balanced specialization with adaptability in ways that allowed it to thrive in the challenging environments of the late Devonian. Its skull morphology reveals a sophisticated predator capable of processing a wide variety of prey types. The flattened profile and dorsally positioned eyes suggest an ambush hunter that waited motionless in shallow water until prey ventured within striking distance. But the robust jaw muscles and varied tooth patterns indicate an animal also capable of active pursuit and processing of hard-bodied arthropods. This ecological flexibility was crucial because the late Devonian environment was anything but stable. Climate was shifting rapidly between greenhouse and icehouse conditions. Sea levels rose and fell repeatedly, creating and destroying coastal habitats with unprecedented frequency. Forest composition was evolving as plant communities adapted to changing atmospheric chemistry and climate patterns. Species that were too specialized for specific environmental conditions faced repeated extinction risks during these environmental transitions. But species like Ichthyostega that could exploit multiple habitat types and food sources had access to refugia during environmental crises and new opportunities during environmental recoveries. The anatomical innovations that enabled this ecological success were remarkable in their coordination and precision. Every major organ system had to be modified simultaneously to support terrestrial life, requiring evolutionary changes of unprecedented scope and complexity. The skeletal system underwent fundamental reorganization. The vertebral column strengthened to support body weight against gravity, with different regions specializing for different functions. Neck vertebrae developed to allow head movement independent of body orientation. Trunk vertebrae became more robust with stronger muscle attachment sites. The tail, once a primary propulsion organ, was reduced to a secondary structure. The limb bones themselves were engineering marvels of biological adaptation. Unlike the thin, flexible fin rays of their aquatic ancestors, tetrapod limb bones were thick, robust structures capable of supporting body weight and generating propulsive forces against solid substrates. The joints between bones became more sophisticated, with complex articulation surfaces, allowing precise ranges of motion in multiple directions. But perhaps most remarkably, the muscle arrangements required for terrestrial locomotion were completely different from those used for aquatic swimming. Fish locomotion relies primarily on axial muscles that produce body undulation. Tetrapod locomotion requires sophisticated appendicular muscles that coordinate precise limb movements while maintaining body stability against gravity. The nervous system had to evolve new capabilities to control these complex muscular patterns. The spinal cord developed more sophisticated neural circuits for coordinating limb movement. The brain expanded regions associated with motor control, spatial navigation, and sensory integration. The inner ear modified its balance organs to function effectively in a gravity-dominated environment. The respiratory system achieved perhaps the most elegant evolutionary solution of all. The dual system of gills and lungs that worked so effectively for late Devonian species allowed these creatures to exploit both aquatic and terrestrial environments while maintaining respiratory efficiency in both. When aquatic conditions were favorable, gills provided efficient oxygen extraction from water. When terrestrial opportunities arose, lungs enabled effective air breathing. This respiratory flexibility was crucial for surviving in the variable environments of the late Devonian, where seasonal drying could eliminate aquatic habitats for months at a time. The cardiovascular system had to coordinate with these respiratory innovations to ensure adequate oxygen delivery throughout the body. Heart structure became more complex, with better separation of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Blood vessels developed more sophisticated arrangements to support both aquatic and terrestrial metabolic demands. Temperature regulation presented entirely new challenges that required innovative physiological solutions. Aquatic environments maintain relatively stable temperatures due to water's high thermal inertia. Terrestrial environments subject organisms to rapid and dramatic temperature fluctuations that can exceed the tolerance ranges of aquatic species. Early tetrapods developed behavioral and physiological strategies for managing these thermal challenges. Behavioral thermoregulation involved using environmental features like sun exposure and shade to maintain optimal body temperatures. Physiological modifications included changes in blood vessel arrangements that could either conserve or dissipate heat as environmental conditions demanded. The sensory adaptations required for terrestrial life were equally sophisticated and far-reaching. Water and air have fundamentally different physical properties that affect how light travels, how sound propagates, and how chemical signals disperse. Sensory organs optimized for aquatic environments often perform poorly in terrestrial settings without significant modification. Vision required perhaps the most complex adaptations. The cornea had to become more curved to compensate for the different refractive properties of air compared to water. The lens developed more sophisticated focusing mechanisms to handle the variable optical conditions of terrestrial environments. Most importantly, the neural processing systems had to learn to interpret entirely new types of visual information. Terrestrial visual scenes are incredibly complex compared to aquatic environments. Multiple objects exist at different distances, creating intricate patterns of overlap and occlusion. Lighting conditions vary dramatically throughout the day and across different microhabitats. Shadow patterns can conceal both predators and prey, requiring sophisticated visual processing to distinguish between dangerous and harmless stimuli. The auditory system underwent equally dramatic modifications. The lateral line system that allows fish to detect water movement becomes useless in air. Early tetrapods had to evolve entirely new mechanisms for detecting airborne vibrations using bones originally designed for gill support. This repurposing of gill bones into middle ear structures represents one of evolution's most elegant solutions to the challenge of aerial hearing. The same bones that once supported respiratory water flow became precisely tuned sound transmission elements, allowing tetrapods to detect and locate sounds in their terrestrial environments. And so we return to our world 400 million years later, carrying within us the legacy of those first brave steps onto ancient shores. That clumsy scramble across late Devonian mud wasn't just about survival. It was the moment when life refused to accept limits, when evolution wrote its most audacious chapter, when the impossible became inevitable. Every heartbeat in your chest echoes the three-chambered heart that first learned to pump blood through a gravity-bound body. Every breath you draw uses lungs that first tasted the alien chemistry of primordial air. Every step you take follows the neural pathways carved by creatures learning to navigate a three-dimensional world that had never known vertebrate footprints. From those tentative first steps came everything: the thunderous migrations of wildebeest across African plains, the precise flight patterns of Arctic terns crossing polar skies, the gentle touch of a mother's hand, made possible by limbs that first gripped onto submerged logs in ancient swamps, the very thoughts forming in your mind right now, processed by a brain that evolved from the neural innovations required to see, hear, and move in terrestrial environments. The late Devonian pioneers couldn't have imagined that their desperate adaptations to changing environments would echo across geological time, creating ripples that would eventually produce consciousness capable of understanding its own origins. They were simply trying to survive another day in a world that offered them no guarantees. But their courage in facing the unknown, their success in solving problems that had never existed before, their legacy written in the DNA of every terrestrial vertebrate alive today, makes them the true authors of our story. In learning to live between two worlds, they created the foundation for everything we've become and everything we might yet become. That single step onto land wasn't just survival. It was the beginning of everything.